Chapter 199, Declaration of a Fight to the Death. My Lord. Sophia stood at the throne, dutiful and composed. Fleet-wide communications are online. Your projection has been broadcast to every battleship. Doom nodded and straightened his shoulders, presenting the most resolute, majestic posture he could muster. Across the Imperial fleets, Space Wolves, the First Legion, the First Fleet, the holographic image on every bridge flickered to life. He cut a heroic figure, deep-set eyes, a presence that drew attention. On the bridge of the Space Wolves, Russ smiled faintly. His exceptional brother's looks and bearing were, by ordinary human standards, more conventionally handsome than his own. The captains of the First Legion dropped to one knee on their respective bridges, paying homage and recalling the teachings of the Emperor's son. And on the Nerships, the people of the Noor worlds listened to King Newick's declaration in their final, waning moments. Citizens of the Imperium, fellow humans. Doom spoke slowly, without the usual rallying cadence. His tone was solemn and sorrowful. I am ordering you to die. His words, carried by the broadcast and the heavy hush that followed, felt like a leaden weight pressing on every heart that heard him. Death is terrifying, he continued. It is the end of everything, the final place where all life ceases. You will fear it, and that is not cowardice. No one is without that fear. The Primarch's magnetic voice laid out the inevitability of death, and in a strange, paradoxical way, it loosened the tight coil of dread in the mortals' chests. As the Emperor's son had said, death ends all things. No matter how fiercely one resists, it will come. But I admire you. Doom's voice dropped, then rose again, as he put the rhetorical training he'd received to use. I admire the courage of every mortal. The great Primarch spoke without affectation, his eyes bright with genuine respect. You left your own worlds and challenged the vast, unfathomable void with nothing but your courage. You have lit the way forward for humanity with the glow of that courage. You meet death not by fleeing from it, but by facing it bravely. At his words, the mortals straightened and swelled with pride. After all, they were the bravest among them. You do not possess bodies tempered for war like mine, Doom said, his voice even and cold at first. You do not wear ceramite like a space marine, and many of you do not even have proper clothes to hide your flesh. All of those things together make mortal life seem ordinary and small beside our extraordinariness, he continued. A hard smile touched his face. Then his tone shifted, rising with an intensity that surprised everyone present. And yet, it is for that ordinariness that I admire you. The Primarch's voice became unusually impassioned. To look into the abyss of Xenos horror and lacking the strength of a gene-sired warrior or the protection of ceramite, still pick up a rusted rifle. That courage is purer than the courage of a space marine, perhaps even purer than ours. The mortals before him could not hold back their tears. Their aching, humbled faces crumpled. Their struggle had been seen, acknowledged, exalted. The Space Marines, standing nearby, listened in silence. Then, slowly, they turned their helmets and plated shoulders toward the kneeling humans. Even those born for war were forced to ponder the Primarch's words. What struck them was not simply praise, it was a thunderbolt in their minds. If they were to strip away their armor, if the Emperor's power were not there to lend them their edge, would they still stand steadier than the common man when confronted with the void and its terrors? The war is thus, Doom declared, voice ringing through the hall. The Imperium's destiny stands at a crossroads. You have all seen the Randan threat with your own eyes. He paused, and the single word he let loose afterward hung in the air like a summons, fierce, uncompromising. Now, I order you to die, to fight the Xenos to the last breath. Primer, Chush Doom roared, and the shout made every man and woman straighten their spines. Are you willing? He demanded, his voice a rolling war drum that seemed to question each soul in the chamber. Willing? Of course they were. But that truth had been buried so deep no one had ever voiced it like this before. A murmur answered, small at first. Willing. Far down in the ship, among the slave laborers in ragged clothes, the sound was only a faint whisper. Then, like atoms striking in a chain reaction, one after another, the most humble, the ones who usually kept silent, found their voices and spoke the smallest, most absolute thing they possessed. I am willing to die for you. I am willing to sacrifice for the master of mankind. From the lowest ranks a roar rose, raw and pure. Each voice alone was tiny, but they joined and swelled until they became a single, unstoppable tide. For the Imperium, for the Emperor, for the Primarch, for victory. Captain Doom rose, drew his ceremonial command blade, leveled it at the Randan fleet, and cried out so loudly the words carried across the battle net. With our sacrifice, let us lay the foundation for the Imperium's victory. Morale surged. Doom bellowed, "All forces attack! Annihilate the Xenos!" As if answering a summons, the fleet's engines belched blazing plasma trails. Battleships surged forward like living weapons, charging without hesitation toward the Randan line. In the void, they seemed to become great longswords, hungry for the enemy's blood. "Wolf cubs, do you hear me?" Russ's feral roar cut through the Space Wolves' channel. "With the blade of sacrifice, slaughter the Imperium's foes. For the Allfather, for Russ, for the Primarch, for victory." The wolves howled in reply and drove their ships at the Xenos. The younger warriors, the wolf cubs, vied to outdo one another, each determined not to be outshone by the mortal crews. In the Morse system, the human fleet poured out as well, signaling the start of the decisive engagement. "Humans," one commander broadcast, "will cast aside ceremony and fight like men." No sooner had that declaration been made than the Randan answered on every channel at once, their message dripping with the same arrogance and contempt as always. "I'll smash your brains onto the deck and trample them," Russ snarled, his intent unmistakable as he drove his fleet straight for the Randan flagship. The Randan commander, all towering menace and contempt, shot back, "I wouldn't mind having another dog as a pet." Even at the height of a decisive engagement, neither side would concede face. Morale could turn a hard fight into a rout. The Imperium's combined fleet surged forward without hesitation and slammed into the Randan bioships. The two forces became locked in a mutual slaughter. Wave after wave of capital ships smashed together, dozens of hulls entangled in a deadly embrace and neither side willing to break. Outnumbered, the Imperium might have expected to falter, but their morale was a fresh adrenaline shot, powering ship after ship with uncanny ferocity. That fearless momentum caught the Randan off guard, and in the opening clash they slipped behind. Watch the fleet's posture. Doom's thick brows drew together as he warned, "Courage is not the same as recklessness." He monitored the battle constantly, directing frontline deployments and cutting off any hot-headed captains who tried to break formation or drive crippled battleships into suicidal rams. The hardest part of command was striking the balance between bolstering morale and stopping men from letting bloodlust cost them the fleet. Under his orders, the Imperium used the nearby star as a pivot and swept forward in a broad arc, like the second hand of a clock. From the opposite side, Russ's Wolves fleet closed the circle, flanking and beginning to encircle the Randan armada. Lances, macrocannons, torpedoes, and swarms of fighters were all brought to bear. The Imperium held nothing in reserve. At the front, the Royal Majesty and 3 Gloriana-class battleships advanced abreast, forming 4 concentrated fire support points to rake through the Xenos formations. The Royal Majesty was the largest of them all, fitted with Nur technology and personally manned by Iron Man Gates, a ship whose firepower outclassed anything else on the field. The macro-cannon array could hurl projectiles at half the speed of light, 5 times faster than the Imperium's standard weapons, which topped out at 1/10 c. Because kinetic energy rises with the square of velocity, that difference wasn't a small multiplier. It translated into orders of magnitude more destructive power. The battleship led the vanguard. No Xenos capital ship could survive 2 macro-cannon strikes. It was an unstoppable force. Every salvo carved whole battle groups to pieces. Because of that firepower, the Nur fleet spearheaded the assault. 200 capital ships formed the attack line. Blue plasma lances hammered the formation non-stop, and the concussion of heavy biotorpedoes made void shields stutter and flare. Smaller vessels that couldn't evade in time ruptured spectacularly, their hulls blowing open and scattering molten debris into the black like falling stars. Doom watched without changing expression. He had long understood the calculus of war, that victory required sacrifice. Nur ships were technologically superior, but not invincible. The grim comfort, for him, was that their teleportation systems were advanced enough to evacuate personnel before a doomed ship blew apart. Crews were rarely lost to sudden destruction. Highly automated battleships needed only a skeleton crew, which kept human casualties low. After this engagement, the green sailors aboard would be stamped as void veterans. The Royal Majesty's shields fluttered. As the spearhead, 20 Randan capital ships pressed in, hemming her in from every vector. Iron Man Gates' consciousness was linked directly into the ship. Mechanical arms and servos adjusted systems with inhuman precision, calculating the Randan firing arcs and threading evasive vectors down to impossible tolerances. A warning cut through the cockpit. A blue rim on the status disc snapped crimson, and a mechanical voice repeated, "Boarding, boarding." The alarm continued, sharp and flat. During a shield flicker interval, Randan boarding parties have breached the shield. Doom let out a humorless chuckle. "Let the Iron Men stretch their limbs," he said. "Weren't they whining their bodies were getting rusty?" Command acknowledged. Contacting the Iron Men now. Gates' mechanical hand moved like lightning across the controls, fingers completing the sequence with millimeter timing. The ship obeyed as one. Iron Man, attack! Chapter 202, Iron Man Attack. The Randan boarding pods had found a weak point in the Royal Majesty and breached it. Hundreds of elite Randan warriors poured into the ship, weapons raised and hearts set on finding human thralls to enslave. What met them instead was not what they'd imagined. The interior architecture of the warship was alien, cold, efficient, and almost entirely devoid of the human captives the Randan had expected. At either end of the wide corridor, heavy metallic footsteps announced the approach of several tall machines. They were not all the same. Some bore 4 massive mechanical legs folded against their backs, their torsos bristling with more than a dozen weapons. Others were humanoid, slim and refined, moving with an unnerving, almost balletic precision. Fragile, scarce, not worth killing. A synthesized voice issued the words flatly. There was no inflection, but the contempt in that monotone was unmistakable. The Randan did not hesitate. They leveled their weapons and unleashed a volley of blue plasma bolts down the corridor. "I'll go first," the slender humanoid replied. It flickered, vanishing from its original position as if a trick of light. In the next instant, using short-range teleportation, it reappeared amid the Randan ranks. Their bodies were black as mirrors, thin blades extending from their hands, crimson electronic eyes glowing with murderous intent. "Aliens, die!" The machines cried. These killing machines had been built by humans with an ingrained hatred of aliens. In the Golden Age, humanity had not won friends among the galactic species. It had carved out its dominance with weapons, not diplomacy. The Iron Man units moved with terrifying speed. Their finger-like blades were razor-sharp, purpose-built for slaughter in close quarters. A long mechanical arm swept through the corridor. Before the Randan could react, their personal shields failed against the blades, and they were shred instantly. After the strike, the machine bounded, spun through the air, and hooked itself upside down from the corridor ceiling. The sight of those machines froze the Randan warriors with fear. They raised their firearms and opened fire on the terrifying figure hanging above them. Before the plasma bolts could reach them, the armored suit's targeting arrays finished their calculations. A black blur shimmered and dove back into the alien ranks. The two figures spread their arms, tiptoeing like dancers, and launched into a lethal ballet amid the barrage. The blades in their hands were unstoppable, gliding over the Randan's bio-armor as if it were paper. Thin, precise cuts marked every kill. With each leap and descent, Randan warriors collapsed, helmets pierced, brains shredded with surgical accuracy. The two Iron Men moved as one. Their linked electronics made their coordination seamless, ripping the enemy formation apart. "Target locked, aliens," their systems announced. While the blades continued to slaughter, the heavily armored suits opened fire with everything mounted on their frames. Disintegration rays, plasma cannons, gravity weapons, decay fields, and disruptor cannons. Their mechanical legs flexed and sank slightly as the torso-mounted armaments unleashed in unison, overwhelming the Randan troops in an instant. Miniature missiles streaked from the machine's 4 legs, while gun emplacements on their platforms swiveled into position, locked on, and unleashed devastating barrages. The legged units were like elegant assassins, swift and precise, while the platformed ones were lumbering heavy hitters, bristling with all manner of weapons. These were ancient constructs. Even a single heavily armored Iron Man could deliver the firepower of an entire company of mortals. Under that onslaught, the Randons' personal shields overloaded instantly. Their bioarmor was either shredded into particles or left as mangled corpses. The Iron Man's targeting was surgical. Every shot erased a Randon and spared its Iron Man kin. The Randons' counterfire was feeble and futile. Plasma and ion streams died harmlessly against the Iron Man's multiple, overlapping shields. 10 seconds of concentrated fire, devastating in such a tight formation, left none of the Randons who had poured out of the boarding pods alive. The wide corridor was scarred by the exchange. Only scorched, blackened earth lay in front of the Iron Man. The assassin stepped out from among the last Randon corpses, its gait still unnervingly elegant. Its synthetic voice, cool and clipped, murmured to a nearby companion. Crude. The heavily armored Iron Man sheathed its weapons, engaged its cooling systems, and let its optics flash once before answering. Efficient. Another unit reported over the network. Madam Sophia, we can dispatch engineering teams to repair the damaged warship. We'll move to the next boarding point for support. No need. Sophia's digital signal came back sharp and matter-of-fact. They've already neutralized the alien threat. You're the slowest group. The 4 Iron Men froze, their electronic eyes sweeping across one another in a silent assessment, then turned and retraced their route. Aliens fragile, their synthesized chorus echoed down the corridor, as if lamenting the lack of a stiffer challenge. It was a minor episode in a much larger engagement. Nur's fleet had layered defenses against Randon boarding attempts. Nightwatch, Custodes, Iron Men, Destroyer Warriors, elite units that could teleport to breach points on an instant. Beyond them, the First Legion's 10,000 Astartes, integrated into the Void Fleet, stood ready as yet another formidable bulwark against any Randon incursion. With the Space Wolves fleet at full Legion strength and a Primarch personally present, any attempt to board Randon was nothing short of suicidal. The slaughter in orbit was merciless. In the engagement zones between the two forces, wreckage from human and alien vessels littered the void. Corpses, humans, Randon, and other alien bodies had been torn from their ships and hung frozen in space, their faces frozen in contorted grimaces that silently testified to how savage the fighting had been. On the surface, as the battle overhead raged, the fighting was no less brutal. It was like 2 serrated meat grinders closing on each other, tearing through flesh and bone until little remained but pulp. Heavy cannons bellowed in unison, each salvo like the war hammer of a god striking the earth, setting the ground to tremble. The air tasted of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, a nauseating blend that hung over the battlefield. Around the human positions, the former wasteland had turned into a swamp, a dark red mire of blood mixed with the ashes of the dead. In the swamp, zombie-like figures stumbled forward and were cut down in an instant by withering fire, collapsing into the dark red muck of blood and peat. The hellish sight ground at every soldier's nerves and tested the limits of their endurance. "Sir, they're coming." The Mechanicum Master's voice broke through Autumn's headset. He had picked up faint vibrations beneath the artillery concussion, signs that the Randon were tunneling underground to launch an assault. 100 contacts in total, 70 heading toward our sector, 30 toward the Imperial positions. Autumn scanned the projected tunneling locations and keyed his comms. "Nightwatch brothers, your work has arrived." He sent the message and flagged the threat for a specialist to handle. "Understood," came the Nightwatch reply. "We will eliminate them immediately." Autumn nodded and forwarded the intelligence to Grandmaster Urian so the Imperial line could prepare for the subterranean attack. Along the nerve front, an odd and precise tableau took shape. 1,000 Nightwatch had deployed to 70 exact points along the line, forming neat ranks at each location. Waiting, disciplined, and ready to intercept whatever rose from beneath the ground. "This is it." The veteran drew a straight line in the dirt with the butt of his rifle and motioned the new recruits into formation. "Aliens are directly beneath us, 100 meters down. They'll pass under this spot in 10 seconds. This is a blind firing drill." The Nightwatch recruits leveled their long rifles at the ground. helmets flickering with holographic overlays. They would have to use their dimension rays to reach the creatures below without a direct line of sight. The veteran didn't give a traditional countdown. He held a small timer in his hand instead. "Prepare," he said calmly, eyes locked on the shrinking numbers. Each recruit watched the convergence point displayed in their helmet HUDs, waiting for the moment the angles crossed. "Fire," the veteran barked, slamming the timer. His timing was calculated to the millisecond. He'd even allowed for human reaction time. A sharp sizzle cut through the air. Sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. 10 rifles spat blue-white beams into the earth. The dimension rays tore into the tunneling machines below, severing metal and flesh alike. They fired in steady bursts as they withdrew, tracking and striking the marked signal points until the threat passed. Dimension rays cut through everything. They blasted straight through 100 meters of sand and rock, as if it were mist, slicing into the tunneling machines burrowing far below the surface. The Randon had pushed forward underground, their warriors taut with anticipation, ready to burst up through the soil and raid the human defensive lines from within. Then, without warning, blue beams lanced down from the tops of the tunneling rigs, driving through every compartment. Men and aliens alike were shredded where they stood. Engines that had chewed through kilometers of earth died in an instant. The Randan found themselves trapped in their own tunnels. Seconds later, the seismographs confirmed it. Every tunneling device had stopped moving. "Well done, lads." The veteran gave a quick wave to signal the end of the assault. "Technicians, move in, drill holes and pour concrete, seal them off completely." That same brutal efficiency unfolded all along the Nur front. Autumn's forces exploited the peculiar properties of their weapons to meet the subterranean assault and make it impossible for the Randan to emerge. On the Imperial front, the response was different, but no less prepared. The First Legion stood ready in black armor. When the aliens did burst up through the earth, they were met immediately by a wall of hard men primed to cut them down. The First Legion suffered a catastrophic loss of roughly 10,000 warriors in the ground fighting. The remaining 30,000 fell back to the base, where they quickly regrouped and easily repelled the Randan assault. The land battle mirrored the space engagement. The Randan could no longer maintain their advantage in fleet combat. With their forces badly mauled and options running out, the alien armada made a desperate decision. They would deploy the battle moon. Chapter 201, Boarding Action. 2 battle moons loomed over the battlefield. One held position like a sentinel, blocking any surprise attack from the left flank. The other drifted forward, moving agonizingly slow toward the space wolves. The Royal Majesty's guns worried the Randan overlord. Its presence had neutralized much of the battle moon's firepower advantage, so the Xenos fleet eased off on the capital and poured their weight into the right flank. There the enemy's fury was almost tearing the defensive line apart. No one could ignore those artificial moons. They were enormous, unnatural, and every human commander had his eye on them. The Randan movements were noted immediately. To allow them free rein near those machines was unthinkable. Russ brought up a lifelike hologram and contacted Doom. "Brother," he said on the comm, "you wouldn't be caught unprepared, would you?" He expected as much. Doom was a master of textbook warfare and should have contingencies ready. Still, Russ hedged his bets. "If you have no other option, I'll have the Raffenkel ram it, and then we'll destroy that Xenos construct." On the Rankles bridge, Russ folded his hands beneath the table and kept his face composed, but his fingers were clasped tight. For the first time in a long while, he felt genuinely, quietly nervous. He had feared his brother would answer, "All right, at this point, the only option is to ram it with a battleship." "I am well prepared," Doom's calm reply reassured Russ. He knew that, though his brother's words had a joking edge, the plan was real enough. Against a behemoth like that, a Gloriana-class battleship looked negligible. Only a desperate ramming maneuver might stop the Battle Moon's advance. "I look forward to your surprise," Russ said with a grin, and closed the holographic link. Freed from that immediate worry, he could concentrate fully on the fleet action unfolding before him. Doom closed his eyes and, through the psychic bond with his sons, latched onto their beacons. "Commence operation," he ordered. In the scout ship's hangar, Captain Odysseus paced. The mission target was drifting away, and the destroyer warriors still sat in meditation, their black armor an immobile ring around the bay. Then, as if someone had given a silent command, every warrior stirred at once. Kebrel snapped erect and shouted, "Captain Odysseus!" "Now!" Bored, Odysseus roared to the custodes, not bothering to ask where the signal had come from. With the Morse star system in chaos, action was preferable to hesitation. Kebrel gave a curt nod. His brothers moved at once, seizing their corn blades and shouldering aboard the transport with the custodes. They had waited too long for this moment, impatient to tear down the Xenos' abomination and claim victory for their gene-father. "The hunt has begun," he declared. The daemons behind them murmured with grim delight. After so long trapped in the material realm, they could at last slip back into the warp. "We will explode loud and brilliant," one hissed. "We will not disappoint. Less talk." A destroyer warrior, one hand wrapped around a sealed jar, slammed it and rattled it until the noise echoed. The sound, or whatever was contained within, sent the great demon staggering, snapping it into the rune-warded barrier where it reeled, disoriented. The gold and black armored warriors finished boarding. The transport peeled out of the scout ship's hangar and drifted toward the battle moon like a leaf on a tide. The scout vessel's internal transports were wrapped in optical camouflage. After the brief burn to clear the gravity well, their engines went silent to avoid detection. There were few warships in orbit of the battle moon. The front line had drawn nearly every capital ship into the main engagement. The vacuum around the moon was deliberately sparse, perfect for those who could move unseen. The open internal port of the battle moon gave the boarding party the perfect chance. The hangar was largely empty. Only a handful of crippled warships lay in for repairs, so the optics of the stealth transports could carry them straight in. Those ships hid visually and masked most sensors only minimally. If the battle moon had swept its immediate vicinity instead of focusing elsewhere, the incoming craft would have shown up on the scan. As it happened, the battle moon's long-range sensors were being driven at full power toward the frontline fighting. Small, local disturbances were being filtered out as nothing more than drifting debris. Taking advantage of that blind spot, the destroyer warrior pilots feathered their course with careful inertia adjustments and slipped the transports into the port. "That'll do," he said, springing to his feet and charging to the hangar. His brothers were already there, helping him strap on his jump pack. "Prepare to launch," someone ordered. "The hatch will open in 5 seconds. We'll boost up through the opening." The custodes stood motionless, helmets tilted to the transport ceiling, their flight packs alive and humming. The auxiliary AI's voice piped into the channel, calm and precise. 3, 2, 1. With the last syllable, the hatch above them blew open with a thunderous crack. For maximum speed, directional charges had been embedded in the transport's roof, so the whole team could deploy in an instant. "Move!" The command cut through the cabin, and before the Xenos could react, the boarding party's flight packs kicked in, hurling them into the sky. "What a weapon!" Odysseus breathed over the comms. The Nur-pattern boarding wingsuits pushed past everything the sensor suite knew. According to the data feed, their plasma thrusters could sustain Mach 3 in atmosphere, and once in vacuum, burst instantly beyond Mach 10. The packs unfolded like living wings, many automatic joints flexing to adjust posture as they went. 10 plume-like exhausts ran along the wing bones, ejecting segmented jets that shifted state on the fly, so the whole ascent felt impossibly smooth. Lightweight yet brutally powerful, the suit let even Kebrel, the shield captain, smile as he rode the surge. "Everyone, climb to my mark," he said on the channel. He'd already painted a vector on every HUD. Only by passing through that corridor could they get inside the battle moon. "Alert!" The transport's warning stuttered into their ears, a sharp intrusion that cut the exhilaration. "Alert!" Red warning lights bathed the battle moon in scarlet. The warship's AI announced in a clipped, mechanical voice, "Enemies have breached the spaceport. Per protocol, seal all spaceport access routes. Technical personnel evacuate. Combat teams intercept the intruders." The AI reacted instantly, sealing the docks and sending warriors out to meet the threat. Odysseus barked a warning as he led the counterattack deeper into the vessel. "The Xenos know we're here. Stay sharp." The destroyer warriors took to the air. Their flight packs gave them blistering speed. Only the custodes could keep up with their reactions. Over 300 superhuman figures streaked across the spaceport from above, moving with the precision and ease of birds weaving through alien architecture. They folded through the twisting towers and spires of Xenos construction, searching for the intruders. Human intruders, prepare to die. Randan roared from the fortress walls, his voice thick with contempt. How, he thought, could a mere few hundred attackers hope to damage a war behemoth like the Battle Moon? You arrogant trash, he spat. You dare board our war fortress? His disdain was short-lived. A messenger drone zipped past him. Lolos's feed bloomed across Randan's display. The report was blunt and unsettling. The intruders wore golden armor and moved with terrifying efficiency. The warriors were far more formidable than a routine raid. Randan's sneer hardened into a curse. Lolos's intelligence had reached him too late to be comforting. These weren't ordinary marauders. The battle, he realized, would be harder and far bloodier than he'd expected. Even the human informants had reported it. The golden-armored warriors among humanity were aid to be more formidable than even space marines. How much more formidable could they be? On the Battle Moon, there was no room for doubt. A single one of them could turn the tide of an assault. "I'll clear the way," Kebril said, surging to the front of the team and activating his dimensional halberd. The ship's artificial intelligence had sealed the passage, but that wouldn't stop them. The 3-meter, high-powered dimensional blade bit into the steel like a hot knife through butter, carving a wide breach in the locked doorway. Odysseus charged in behind him. A gleaming golden boot slammed into the foot-thick door panel and sent it yawning open. A clean, instant follow-through. "Custodes, disperse and breach," the shield captain barked, and the boarding party split into multiple squads to push deeper into the Battle Moon. It was a planned tactic. Over 300 operatives separated into small teams so the Xenos couldn't discern their true objective. To create a diversion, each destroyer warrior carried a jar so the Xenos couldn't tell the real ones from the decoys. Odysseus nodded once to Kebril and was the first to plunge into the Battle Moon's interior. As he crossed the threshold, the interior gravity generators grabbed him and began to pull him into a slow fall. The flight pack's anti-grav cut in a heartbeat. Its wings unfolded and made a series of precise adjustments until he was hanging perfectly still in midair. A private smile touched him. This pack was an industrial marvel, but there was no time to admire engineering. Xenos were pouring toward them from every direction along the steel hall. No orders were needed. The custodes and the destroyer warriors moved with silent coordination. They dialed the packs up a notch, refusing to get bogged down in close combat, and skimmed the ceiling in tight formation. Bang! 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 The custodes' bolt guns barked, picking out and cutting down the Randan overlords before those enemies could bring suppressive fire to bear on the flying team. The destroyer warriors' shoulder cannons locked onto high-threat targets while their flight packs burned at full power. They pushed through the gravity well at Mach 1, not because the packs couldn't go faster, but because Mach 1 was the physical limit of custodes and destroyer warriors themselves. They threaded their way through the twisting Xenos architecture, firing to kill any Randan warriors who tried to intercept them, all the while keeping razor-sharp attention on their flight path. These were the ultimate warriors among humanity, handling their packs like living lightning. Nothing could stop them. Randan overlords in flight suits rushed in to block the advance, but the boarding party tore past so cleanly that the overlords only brushed them and then tumbled from the sky. Approaching landing, no room to maneuver, came a quick comms report. In 30 seconds, the squad had covered 10 kilometers and plunged into an increasingly cramped pipe. The Randan couldn't keep up. Their suits simply lacked the speed to match the boarding party. A custodes warrior unclipped a small, gilded reconnaissance eagle from his belt and launched it into the tunnel to scout the terrain ahead. "We're still 200 kilometers from the outer detonation point," Kebril said evenly. "It has to go off within that range to do the most damage." Odysseus lifted an arm and tapped his forecom to display the eagle's feed. "The flight isn't going to be smooth," he said. "Xenos picking us up ahead, fighters and anti-air batteries. They're trying to cut us off. Cabril's voice, muffled by the helmet, sounded almost amused. Isn't that perfect? Fighters in AA mean they've concentrated their defenses. Once we punch through that screen, there'll be room to work. He nodded toward the hulking war-forged corn weapon slung behind them. If everything else fails, he added, that will make the Xenos turn on each other. Odysseus gave a short, dry laugh. Third one today, he said. Angels, huh? Chapter 204, Tipping Point. The custodes moved without sound. Forged personally by the Emperor and stripped of all superfluous emotion, they existed to serve the master of mankind with singular, unflinching focus. Their duty was carried out quickly and without fanfare. Psychologically, they were predisposed to seamless coordination with one another. The destroyer warriors were no less silent. Tempered by 10,000 years of hardship and solitude, their hearts had grown accustomed to loneliness and indifference. They too needed no shouted orders. Seasoned warriors shared a close, almost instinctive telepathy that let them act as one. Clad in black and gold and identical in stature, the two contingents flowed through the gate together into the ecological enclosure. Before them unfurled a strip city, 100 kilometers across, and plunging into the distance as if the horizon had no end. Several artificial suns floated high beneath a glass dome that simulated blue sky and drifting white clouds. On either side, futuristic cityscapes of gleaming steel and engineered habitats rose in interlocking tiers, a landscape both engineered and theatrical that filled the superhuman warrior's view. The eco-city had been planted like a carefully tended garden. Exotic trees rose between beds of blue, white, and purple blooms, and an ecological river ran the length of the settlement, its clear surface catching the light. It should have been a place of peace on the battle moon. Instead, the gate front thrummed with tension. Dozens of Xeno warriors had gathered there, manning anti-aircraft emplacements. They stood ready, faces tight with expectation. The human intruders had shattered the harmony and were pouring in. The Randan overlord said nothing. It lifted its command sword toward the high arch of the gate and sent a wave of psychic energy sweeping over the field. The defending forces, enslaved contingents of humans, Xenos, and other draft troops, answered that will and moved as one. Spread out, draw their anti-aircraft fire, regroup at the marked locations. Odysseus's order was terse. His jump pack flared to life and he shot forward like an arrow. Behind him, the custodes who had forced their way through the breach in the gate split across the eco-city's skies, flowing after their shield captain. The custodes knew their mission: hold the sky long enough for the destroyer warriors to get in. With their flight packs pushed to overdrive, they tore through the sound barrier, golden silhouettes cleaving the clouds. Bio-enhanced joints and shield buffering systems worked in concert to absorb the murderous inertia. Below them, Randan's anti-aircraft fire stitched the air with lethal intent, solid shells and energy beams crisscrossing the sky. Sonic booms warred with tracer streams as 60 near-invulnerable figures punched through the barrage. Their onboard biocomputers, strengthened by alchemical augmentation, functioned like precise, living supercomputers. The custodes rode the storm of ordnance with bodies engineered to take sudden, brutal swings in G-force during repeated stops and accelerations. Their reflexes operated on a nanosecond scale. Reflexes and physique together made them more agile than even the fastest fighter jets. At the moment the enemy fired densest, Captain Odysseus found a single tenth of a second and used it to transmit his order. Destroyer warriors, entering. The signal was clean and perfectly timed. The barrage that had been focused on 60 custodes no longer posed a fatal threat. Their sacrifice and skill had opened the corridor the destroyer warriors needed. The destroyer warriors slammed through the gate, daemon weapons in hand, while the custodes covered their advance. Above them, the sky had become a chaotic ruin. Randan's interceptor squadrons swarmed, turning each approach into a gauntlet. The custodes answered with a display of deadly airmanship. Using the articulate wings of their flight packs, they rode onto the bellies and tails of pursuing fighters, clinging so close that the jet's automatic guns, Kosser, would no longer bear on them. When a pilot tried to shake them, a custode would snap the pack up and around, pulling level while firing the bolt gun mounted on his guardian spear. Pilot after pilot fell as the interceptors stalled and went down. Their courses were manic and unpredictable, trailing violent arcs through the barrage, bang, 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 as they carved a path forward. Then new, harsher sounds cut through the gunfire, the unmistakable, hollow crack that meant Oromite had been struck. Like a waterfall reversed, anti-aircraft batteries detonated en masse. Shells bloomed, and a dense storm of shrapnel and fragments tore apart the air and enveloped the Custodes. Their dimensional shields flared and guttered under the onslaught, personal shields overloaded in an instant, and the wings of several flight packs splintered away. Randan morale surged. This was the first time the invaders had taken casualties while entering the battle moon. One of the Custodes had fallen from well over 1,000 meters, a height at which even Oromite armor offered no guarantee of survival. Gravity was merciless to anyone who dared to fly that high without functioning gear. Loss of jump pack. Withdrawing from mission, the Custodes announced over the comms, then activated the small teleportation Enk set into his gauntlet. A blue-white curtain of light unfurled, wrapping his body like a cocoon. With a single flash, the golden figure vanished from sight. Odysseus exhaled in relief as several other Custodes followed suit and disengaged safely. Even absent warm brotherly affection, their genetics compelled them to prioritize the survival of their kin with ruthless efficiency. The Primarch had been wise. He valued the life of every warrior under his command. The Randan overlord went rigid, its thoughts racing. It screamed over the open channel, "Find the human transport ship. It's near us." Then it craned its head upward. At the heights above, human warriors swarmed like flies, scattering chaotically and plunging deeper into the city. "You still want to leave?" The Randan overlord tossed the question out, then answered it itself. "Then we will leave first." After a heartbeat's thought, the Xeno overlord realized the humans hadn't come on a suicide run. There was a ship waiting outside for rendezvous. Their plan was to destroy the battle moon and get away. "You will not succeed," it howled. "Before you finish, the battle moon will depart this place and drag you out of the real universe. Even if we are destroyed, we will strand you in the warp." The overlord's furious shriek went unanswered. The Custodes and Destroyer warriors, after a brief skirmish, had already punched through the curtain of anti-air fire. Fixed defensive turrets lay in their path, but the team simply wove between their firing arcs. With an unobstructed 200-kilometer run ahead, their flight packs pushed to 3 times the speed of sound, and they covered the distance in roughly 200 seconds. During the dash, Cabril glanced down. The placid surface of the artificial river below quivered for a moment. "I need to detonate the first bomb. The Xenos have fired up the battle moon's engine. They're going to try to leave." Cabril's voice snapped over the comms. He followed immediately with a warning. "Custodes, beware. The daemon weapon will unleash a powerful psychic backlash." "I understand." Captain Odysseus's reply was flat and measured. He had never witnessed a daemon weapon's true power, but he respected the danger instinctively. "There will be a strong psychic shock. Don't let it pull you under." Cabril reached out along the psychic link to his brothers in the other assault team. With 2 synchronized missions in motion, timing was everything. "How far along are you?" "We're about to detonate." A calm thought returned through the link. "Can detonate. Synchronize in 10 seconds. Cabril allowed himself a brief, tense relief. The other team's progress was only a heartbeat behind his own. "Throw it down," he ordered, voice sharp. The command sent a final instruction to his brothers. Release the demon weapon and hold to the timing. The destroyer warrior moved quickly. He opened the detonation device, set the synchronized timer, pulled back the black cloth, and shoved the greater demon of Khorne out of the container. "Hey, goodbye, everyone. Won't miss you." The bloodthirster sneered, then let out a final desperate roar, never to meet again. The daemon's containment shell plummeted from the sky. Runes along the capsule flared to life, crackling with dense red lightning that mirrored the runes carved into the bloodthirster's flesh. The daemon spread its massive arms and allowed the power inside it to pour outward. The runes drank that power through the blood-red arcs. The bloodthirster's form unraveled, coalescing into a rolling sphere of crimson energy that exuded a raw, chaotic concept. Even before the device detonated, that concept began to taint the surrounding reality. The Randan overlord, whose people were naturally psychic and exquisitely sensitive to shifts in emotion, felt a profound unease. As the humans released the object, the controlled servant army's appetite for slaughter swelled, an instinctive, violent hunger rising inside them. "Do not look at it directly," the overlord ordered immediately, forcing the servant ranks to turn away. Now was not the time to intercept the humans. If the influence on their thralls was not removed, the servant army would go berserk in minutes, and whether they would even obey orders after that was another question entirely. The overlord Randan watched the falling canister cut across the sky, its hull bathing the battlefield in a sinister crimson light. He suspected at once that it was a new human device, engineered specifically to target their race's psychic control, a focused countermeasure. As the servitor line hesitated, the canister opened a slit and something inside bellowed with hateful glee. "Damn, Xenos, feel the wrath of the blood god." "What is that thing?" Randan demanded, voice tight with alarm. Before he received an answer, the container detonated in midair. There were no blinding fireworks and no thunderous blast. Instead, a blood-red concentric wave rolled outwards. It was not merely physical force, but a psychic shock, pure, voracious bloodlust made manifest, and it ignored barriers and armor as it passed through the cold, mechanized ranks. At that instant, Russ, locked in combat below, looked up at the distant battle moon through his viewport and felt two savage eruptions of malice tear through him. In the warp itself, far beyond mortal sight, Khorne stirred on his skull throne and sat up straight. He sensed the bloodthirster returning, the very one that had once slipped beyond his sight. Chapter 203, The Might of Demonic Weapons. The blood god, reclined on his skull throne, watched the real universe and murmured, "An interesting idea." Doom felt that gaze like a physical weight. He narrowed his eyes and turned toward the battle moon. Two bloodthirster bombs had already detonated there. Far deeper, within the warp and beside the soul forge, a demigod experienced a sudden flash of inspiration, mortals wielding demonic power. He braced to investigate, but then detected the presence of the destroyer warrior nearby. Without hesitation, he abandoned his curiosity and slipped back to his abode. On the battle moon, the Randan overlord remained oblivious to the shifts in reality and the currents of the warp. It was, in effect, insane. Creatures caught in the red shockwave were driven utterly mad, their minds collapsing to a single violent imperative: kill. The demonic weapon's taint spread through living things. The battle moon's warp jump stuttered and then halted. Those in the Randan's control room turned on each other, their faces gone blank of reason, their eyes only a blood-red hunger for slaughter. There were no rifles, no missiles, only brutal claw-and-blade close-quarters combat. Every sword drew blood, every strike sought the heart. Only the sight of flowing blood seemed to feed the mad hunger driving them. Blades, teeth, fists, anything that could make another bleed was pressed into service. Mission, strategy, orders, meaningless. Kill, kill, kill! The Randan, psychically delicate and easily possessed by feeling, were sunk so deep into the frenzy they could not pull themselves free. The lust for slaughter made their minds tremble. The servants, already turning on one another, answered a single telepathic command from their overlord: kill. There were no screams or pleading, only furious, bloodthirsty howls that echoed across the battle moon. Inside the shattered war fortress, the AI core glowed a malignant red as it was flooded with kill commands. After a brief reboot, it rewrote its priorities and redirected the automated batteries, targeting the servant ranks. Randan supremacy became the overriding directive. Any life form that attacked a Randan was to be eliminated. The battle moon devolved into chaos, Randan killing, Xenos killing, humans killing, and an unfeeling intelligence adding its firepower to the slaughter. Powerful. The blood god in the warp emitted a pleased growl, his maw widening as the tide of slaughter fed him. Meaningless carnage, pure bloodshed and violence brought Khorne delight. He opened his maw and lavished his blessing on the contested moons. Across both battle moons, killing spread like a contagion, a raw, more savage offering to the blood god. Only the custodes and the destroyer warriors were immune. Their wills were too steady. Even the eruption of a bloodthirster couldn't sway them. These weapons should be used sparingly, Odysseus warned over the comms as he looked down at the ecological city. Below, It had devolved into a hellscape, slaughter everywhere, every living thing driven to kill for killing's sake. With all that bloodshed, the artificial river ran red, and corn daemons began to surface. But whenever a daemon glanced up and saw the destroyer warriors streaking through the air, it ducked back into the blood and vanished. If this weren't an emergency, and the enemies weren't Xenos, the Gene Father would never use these filthy things, Kebril said flatly. He knew all too well the danger demonic weapons posed. You understand what's at stake, Captain Odysseus said, pressing the point. You must safeguard those arms. Above all, ensure they never see use in human wars. Kebril inclined his head, solemn. The demonic armory was anything but easy pickings. Automated batteries ringed its perimeter. Inside, destroyer warriors stood on guard alongside Psyker masters. At the last moment, the armory's dimensional anchor would collapse, and it would slip out of phase, tumbling into another dimension. Only a handful of officers aboard the Royal Majesty even knew its coup, Rodinates. There was no realistic way for that secret to be leaked. With no interference, the boarding party advanced as planned, dropping deep into the heart of the city. Kebril signaled to his brothers. Set the second bomb. They moved to arm the Nurgle device that would finish their mission, the detonation of which would destroy the entire battle moon. Is it safe? Odysseus asked, his voice taut with concern. The memory of the last demonic weapon still haunted him. The Morse star system will be rebuilt after the war, Odysseus said. This device must leave no lasting effects. Absolutely not, Kebril replied, bringing up a data projection. The corrosive energy will fully decay on detonation. There will be no residual contamination. That's good, Odysseus said, nodding. He worried more than most about aftereffects. The true horror of demonic arms was not only their immediate devastation, but the poison they left for future generations. If anything survived, the consequences of the previous slaughter could spread through the entire system. Deployment complete, the destroyer warrior announced. Detonation in 30 seconds. He had synchronized the two Nurgle charges. They would go off at the same instant. Kostos, we can leave, Kebril said, then activated his teleportation lasso and made a clear motion to the others. As one of the mission leaders, he had to set the example. A flare of teleportation light burst around him, and before anyone could blink, Kebril vanished, returned to the scout ship's teleportation point. Odysseus gave a single measured nod, took one last look at the cloth-wrapped canister, activated his teleportation lasso, and vanished. Rings of teleportation light flared, and one by one the Custodes folded out of existence, leaving the battle moon empty of their gold. Only one remained. The last destroyer warrior strode forward in silence, peeled back the black shroud, and revealed the bloated daemon locked inside. Behave, he warned. If you don't get detonated, the next time I summon you, I will personally kill you. The great unclean one's rotten flesh jiggled. Its corpulent bulk shivered as it managed to raise a putrid forelimb in reluctant salute. I will absolutely obey orders, it rasped, pustules bubbling and maggots writhing with grotesque eagerness. The destroyer warrior gave no more than a grunt. He reactivated his teleportation lasso. The countdown clicked down with 5 seconds to go. The daemon's wide maw split into something like a smile, every pustule trembling with delight. May we never meet again, it gurgled. The destroyer warrior sneered and turned for the scout ship. As he left, the great unclean one sagged back into the canister, and with a sound like wet mirth, laughed, hopelessly, happily, for it could at last return to the embrace of its benevolent father. Ha! The great unclean one threw out its bloated arms as runes along its skin crackled with green lightning, siphoning demonic power into the waiting vessel. Its monstrous form shrank as it poured itself in, eager to complete its task. Come, come, it gurgled. At last a sickly green orb hovered inside the canister, pulsing with rune light. There was no thunderous roar, only a quiet, nauseating swell. A circular shockwave, green and viscous as bile, rolled outward. This was no piercing blast like a bloodthirster's. The great unclean one's gift was an integration. Nurgle's rot essence bled into the metal and bone of the battle moon, fusing with its frameworks. Time magic braided with decay, and wherever the sickly wave touched, the battle moon began to change in grotesque, inexorable ways. In Nurgle's garden, the great corruptor looked up from his cauldron. A ladle paused in mid-stir. He patted his bulging belly and smiled with a delighted snort. "How interesting," he said. With a gust of foul air, he reclaimed the great unclean one, drawing the daemon back into his embrace. Mirth erupted around him. Endless rasping laughter as Nurglings danced and tittered, watching their benevolent father's handiwork with glee. The great unclean one, newly returned from the real universe, found himself standing before his benevolent father. He was so overcome that childish tears tracked down his cheeks, and he bawled like a little thing. Nurgle dipped a ladle into the cauldron and fed him the warm, fetid broth. In a voice swollen with kindness, he intoned, "You have a new name, Rustblight." The detonation of the demonic weapon had given Nurgle an idea. From that ruin, he would birth an entirely new, great unclean one that would embody the slow end of steel as time marched on. As Rustblight drank the gift, his bloated form swelled even further. The sickly green of his flesh shifted into the yellowed, rust-streaked hue of oxidized metal. A heavy, corroded pipe wrench, his exclusive instrument of ruin, manifested in his hand. He was transformed. No longer a vague monstrosity at the edge of legend, he stood as a true great demon, strengthened countless times over and personally christened by the benevolent father. "Beloved father," Rustblight murmured, bowing his head to feel that kindly, infectious caress. "Do you wish for revenge?" Nurgle asked, smiling with the awful pride of one who sows plagues. "No, no," the new daemon cried, a broken, wet sound, less a denial of conflict than an affirmation of the purpose that had been given him. "No," Rustblight said it 3 times, trembling as he leaned against Nurgle's bulk. "I don't want revenge." Even after his metamorphosis, the great daemon could not bring himself to strike back at the destroyer warrior. Nurgle did not scold him for his cowardice. Instead, the Plague Lord smiled with only more warmth, one swollen hand absently stroking Rustblight's head. "My child," he murmured, "you have found enlightenment. After your trial, you saw how precious life is. That pleases me." Rust-stained, yellow tears of ichor tracked down Rustblight's face as he reknit himself into a daemon anew. In Nurgle's garden, the scene that followed was almost tender. Daemons gathered, laughing and fawning in a display of filial devotion. But that quiet did not exist beyond the daemon's favor. On the battle moon, time magic rode on Nurgle's corruption, a creeping rot that chewed through everything it touched, elderly and lethal in an instant. Metal flaked to dust, flesh withered, and the once imposing bio-armor slowly aged. Sensors dimmed, systems failed, and the suit's strength bled away toward an inevitable collapse amid the slaughter. Chapter 204, The End of the Randan Campaign. The battle moons were dying. Their steel skins split open in a network of rust, the corrosion crawling across their surfaces like a spreading disease. Inside, the humming heart of their machine minds stuttered and failed. Core arrays collapsed one after another, logic circuits spasmed into delirium. For all intents and purposes, 1,000 years of decay had been compressed into a few breaths. The great war spheres went silent as their metallic bones were eaten away by time itself. From orbit, their surfaces bled from leaden gray to a jaundiced yellow, then into a sick, oozing black. Under the influence of a time-catalyzed viral entropy, both battle moons disintegrated within minutes, matter unmaking itself until there was almost nothing left to see. A dry, final hiss whispered through the void. Russ stared at the ruin and involuntarily drew a breath. For a moment, he could only watch. His brother, he realized, must have unleashed some forbidden power to break the Xenos hold. The thought shocked him, but there was no time for awe. "Fleet, move," he barked, seizing the moment. Wolf cubs, clamp down on the Xenos fleet, cut off every escape vector. With the battle moons gone, Randan had lost its last foothold in the Morse star system. Russ had expected Randan to collapse. Once the enemy's morale broke, they would run, and he would not let them slip away. The Space Wolves' fleet answered with sudden ferocity. Formations dissolved, ships peeled off, and they surged back into the fray. As he had foreseen, there were no organized counterattacks. Randan vessels lost coherence, engines throttled, and whole squadrons turned tail. For the glory of the Legion, the Lord of the Void Sky Army bellowed over the comms, ordering the entire fleet to press home and harvest the wreckage. With the battle moon's destruction, the war had effectively been decided. There was no reason to spare the enemy now, only the clean sweep of victory, the reckoning and the spoil. The First Legion moved to redeem its honor. They would wash away their shame in the blood of the foe. Free engagement. Eliminate the Xenos fleet to the best of your ability. Doom's voice came over the channel, calm and businesslike, as if he were merely assigning routine patrols. But the tone was a disguise. His attention was no longer with the fleet. When the Bloodthirster detonated, Randon lost its high-level command in an instant. With flagship and command nodes gone, fleet captains struggled to cling to any semblance of order. Demonic war engines and foul weapons flared across the dark, one detonation after another. The staccato thunder of their impact was accompanied by something worse, a sense of hungry eyes falling across the system. It was as if the gazes of Khorne and Nurgle themselves had descended, a hot, violent hunger and a slow, rotting patience, and Doom felt them like a presence weighing on him. In that moment, watching the chain reaction he had helped set loose, he could not avoid the thought that what they had won came at a cost he had not fully measured. Demonic weapons were undeniably effective at cutting down enemies in the material universe. But they had a fatal drawback. They drew the attention of the gods. Being marked by the gods was never a good omen. Doom sat on his throne and brooded for a long time before sending a single order over the psychic link. Talasha, go to Nur and deliver this to the Psyker Academy. Suspend all research into demonic weapons. Redirect your efforts toward developing better means to slay the gods. He had sensed a flaw in their strategy and wanted the Psyker Masters to reorient their work. He also dispatched an envoy to oversee the shift personally. Your command will be obeyed, Talasha replied telepathically, and a small Nur ship broke away from the final stages of the battle and slipped into the warp. With that urgent matter settled, Doom turned his attention back to the engagement. Victory demanded caution. The nearer one came to success, the more vigilant one had to remain. History was full of warnings about being undone at the last moment, and those cautions were often the sternest teachers. 2 battle moons had been torn from their course by gravity and were spiraling inward, their orbits collapsing toward the star. It was, grimly, the best possible fate. The star's heat would burn away Nurgle's taint far more effectively than any purging ritual. The space wolves in the First Legion had clung to the enemy like wolves to carrion, tearing through wreckage and looting what remained. Nur's ships fell in behind them, concentrating on fleeing vessels to keep the survivors from slipping into the warp. One by one, Randon warships went down. The fight in space had become a rout. On the planets below, the Randon elite were no better off, fish on the chopping block, waiting for the human blade. Inside Autumn's command center, Grandmaster Urien stood in black armor, solemn and unsteady before his cousin. He had come himself in a Stormhawk before the general offensive, solely to secure a particular authority. Autumn, my battle brother. Urien's face was a pleading mask as he bowed deeply, his voice barely more than a whisper. Autumn stepped forward to support him, then turned to regard the Lord of the Heavenly Host standing behind Urien. Almost all of the First Legion's senior officers were present. Autumn had his suspicions, but wasn't ready to jump to conclusions, so he asked, "What is this about?" Urien stayed bowed at the waist, the warriors behind him mirroring his posture. "Brother, I beg you, grant the First Legion's humble request," he said. The Grand Master remained bowed as well, refusing to raise his head. He couldn't bring himself to look at his cousins. Autumn felt the Grand Master's stubbornness and didn't force him upright. "Speak," he said quietly, and allowed Urien to state his plea. "We are the First Legion, and we crave vengeance." Urien's voice rang out, then softened into something wounded. On this world, the First Legion lost nearly 10,000 brothers. But we crave vengeance, to wash away that shame with the lives of the Xenos, a voice protested from the ranks. "Brother, that is too much to ask. You would have us surrender our honor." Grandmaster Urien straightened slowly and looked up, his face open and earnest. "In my life, I have never begged," he said quietly, and then, as if the weight of the loss broke something in him, he dropped to one knee. "I only ask this. Allow the First Legion the chance to wash away its shame. Let us avenge our fallen brothers." Autumn moved before the knee was fully bent, his massive arm closing around Urien. The servo joints locked with a grinding click. The power armor complained with a metallic groan as the motion was arrested and the kneel halted. There's no need for this. Adam's hand closed on Urian's arm and hauled him upright with a strength that left no room for argument. Do you know how many lives that would cost? Urian's jaw tightened, but Adam didn't let him speak. He laid out the only sensible option: orbital bombardment of the Hive City, then send ground forces in to clear whatever survives. That's the safest plan. He looked at the Grand Master with calm, unshakable resolve. Macro cannons and lance weapons will punch through their defenses. With the Xenos dug into the hives, judicious fire from orbit is our best chance. Brother, Adam used the word deliberately, as if to remind Urian of the weight they both carried. I have to be responsible for everyone, for the Primarch. He paused, forcing Urian to meet his eyes. There are tens of thousands of enemy warriors down there. Even if they're weakened, their strength isn't far short of an Astartes. I must be responsible for you, for the First Legion, and for the mortal legions. This is a battlefield, not a hall of honor, Adam said, voice low but iron. Our priority has to be to eliminate the enemy and preserve what we can. Adam's earnestness cut through Urian's stubbornness. He felt the unexpected force of his brother's grip and heard the conviction in his words. No pretense, no bravado, only duty. The argument was simple and brutal, and Urian knew, correct. He let out a slow breath and nodded. Adam's plan was the most rational, the most efficient course left to them. Adam's reasons left no room for argument. As the commander-in-chief and head of the army, his decision, cold, duty-bound, and stripped of personal feeling, was something to be respected. Urian, clad in gleaming black and gold armor, stood straight and silent for a long moment, while the lords of the heavenly host behind him watched the Grand Master with unreadable expressions. Would he return empty-handed? The question hovered in Urian's mind. Adam, seeing his cousin's downcast mood, offered a compromise. You will carry out the orbital strike, he said, and the First Legion will take the first wave of the assault. That is my greatest concession. He added flatly, this isn't about honor, it's about winning the battle. He looked directly at Urian Bendegard, Grand Master of the First Legion. Urian inclined his head and nodded. It wasn't what he had hoped for, but it was the best outcome he could accept. They could not personally slay every enemy or deliver wholesale destruction to the Xenos, but they could ensure that the souls of their Legion brothers would find peace. Thank you for your generosity, Brother Adam, Urian said. He pulled down his black helmet and bowed once more. Adam, there's no time to argue. Move. Adam hauled the Grand Master to his feet and urged him to fall back. Urian gave a curt nod, marshaled the senior officers into a withdrawing line, and boarded a Stormhawk to take up their assigned station. A First Legion destroyer detached from the fleet and held position over the Hive City, swinging its broadside to bear on the world below. Its guns were already aligning for orbital strikes meant to purge the Xenos from the planet. Urian climbed to the highest point on the transport's aft and opened a Vox channel. Below him stood 3 phalanxes. Of the 40,000 Astartes who had touched down on Morse World, only 30,000 still answered the muster. Turn left. At Urian's command, the First Legion warriors pivoted as one, their faces turning toward the towering Hive City. Our hatred is a flame, the Grand Master rasped, voice raw. It must be fed with the fiercest fire. The Xenos have shamed the Legion and slain our brothers. We will burn the city from orbit, and then we will storm it. Their lives will be offered as tribute for those we lost. Vengeance. The cry rose like a physical thing from 10,000 throats, eager, inexorable. The First Legion braced itself to unleash both orbital fury and the slaughter to follow. Witness the coming of the fire of vengeance, Urian intoned, and raised his arm. From the void ship above, lance beams erupted, stabbing down to strike the Hive City. 30,000 Space Marines stood motionless, their faces unreadable behind black armor as the orange-red light played across their plates, making it seem as if the vengeance itself burned within them. Bereft of its shields, the towering hive, those stacked spires and tenements, was torn apart by the focused beams and collapsed into dust. 207, taking care of some personal matters. I'm tied up with some personal matters today. Last night I had a weird dream. I was visiting the General's special train, with the Imperial Guard trailing behind, when an Indian worshipper of Nurgle attacked the train, and then, unbelievably, the guard ran faster than the damn train. Thank you all for your generous donations. Special thanks to the readers who found typos. I usually post right after finishing a chapter, so I sometimes miss them. Extra thanks to reader Qin Shu Ying, who only started reading recently but has already caught a lot of errors. I'm grateful and waiting here to thank them. Chapter 205, Strangulation, Heaven's Wrath. Once the name people gave to nature's fury, an old, fearful reverence. Later, with the rise of gods and priests, it became a threat, a divine scourge unleashed on the irreverent. Now the phrase had come full circle. Heaven's wrath was no longer an act of the supernatural, but a weapon of men. From the deck of a First Legion battleship, lances of blinding light slammed into the sky. They were humanity's vengeance made physical, threads of pure energy that tore through atmosphere and armor alike. Scorching, high-temperature fire descended in their wake and annihilated everything the Legion had declared enemy. The Randon Legion, once confident, found itself reduced beneath that burning judgment. Amid the strobing glare, the silhouette of Hive City darkened and then crumbled. A metropolis built up over decades, centuries perhaps, collapsed in a heartbeat, buildings vaporizing under repeated lance strikes as if generations were being erased in an instant. Along the outer rim of the Imperial front, defensive shields flared to life, throwing up wavering barriers that absorbed searing radiation and the onslaught of heat. The shields held, but beyond them, the landscape had already been remade by flame and light. The blood-sodden swamp in front of the line steamed away under the blast's heat. Congealed clots of blood, mixed with churned soil, dried into a dark, cracked mud. The lances of light kept hammering, turning the steel ribs of the Hive City to molten slag. The overflowing heat vitrified the ground around it into glassy, blackened crust. The Hive City had no active shield. An orbital strike was enough to obliterate it. When the light finally faded, the Imperial auxiliary troops blinked and lifted their heads. A mushroom cloud rose from the ruins, and far-off tree branches shuddered, their tips bowed inward toward the blasted city. It was a natural effect. The beams had ripped at the atmosphere, and when the shockwave passed, the air rushed back, bending everything in its path. None of it disturbed the Space Marines. They held their positions, watching Randon consumed by the fire of vengeance. Grandmaster Urian stood on the prow of the landing craft, a cold sneer on his face and a hard glitter in his eyes. Where the Hive City's spires had collapsed, faint ripples of shield light still trembled within the wreckage, ghostly echoes amid the ruin. Images streamed into the Grandmaster's helmet display. High-orbit scans showed more than 20,000 Randon warriors still huddled inside the Hive City. A barrier erected by war machines shielded the lower districts, protecting not only the Randon, but the mortal slaves herded among them. They were like turtles trapped in a jar, caged beasts waiting for death. Artillery attack, Grandmaster Urian ordered, his voice cold. He hungered for revenge, but he was no fool. The Randon Xenos were bent on dying. Their remaining fighters were preparing for a desperate, all-or-nothing sortie. If the Legion charged now, the Xenos' counterattack would cost far more lives. So the shelling continued. The bombardment was meant to erode the Xenos' will, shatter their resolve to die, and turn their suicidal fury into bleak, hopeless despair. The First Legion's vengeance would break whatever spirit still held the Randon together, and in crushing that spirit, it would, in a grim way, bring solace to the souls of the Legion's fallen. Artillery shells screamed out of the Legion lines, a metal thunder that seemed to carry the army's hatred. They crashed into the Randon's last positions like iron fists. One after another, the translucent shields rippled under the impacts and finally flickered out, their reserves exhausted. The Randons who had stood ready for the human charge suddenly understood the truth. They were toys in human hands. Their lives were not their own. They could be slaughtered at will. Despair and confusion spread through the ranks. Those among the Randon who were psychically attuned felt their kin's spirit sagging as if struck. Resolve, once RD, was corroded. Each shell struck not only flesh and stone, but the fragile mental barriers that held courage together, cracking them until only fear leaked through. Grandmaster Urian slammed his hammer to his palm, ignited his power sword, and bellowed, "Legion warriors, avenge our fallen brothers! Revenge!" The Legion answered, a roar like a breaking cliff. The First Legion surged forward, black-armored boots pounding the blood-soaked earth, advancing in disciplined, thunderous strides toward the Hive City. The black-armored warriors rolled forward like a tide of shadow, relentless but disciplined, each man covering his neighbor's flank. Even under the madness of a final battle, the First Legion fought with cold, practiced order. Rhino-armored personnel carriers and Predator tanks punched holes in the enemy lines. Storm Eagles screamed overhead. Each vehicle and aircraft acted as a focused point of attack in the Legion's formation. They advanced beneath a curtain of artillery fire, the thunder masking the movement of boots and tread. Those battered black suits of power armor were not just protection, but an emblem. The First Legion's colors, worn by veterans who knew only one purpose: extermination of the Randan Xenos by any means necessary. As the Legion pressed on, the Nur Auxiliary Army answered in kind. The auxiliaries went to full combat readiness. Mortal sergeants rallied their troops and drove them forward, pushing the assault directly toward the Hive City. Behind them, the defensive line bristled with titanic engines of war. The mortal titans pivoted, weapons bearing on the open wilderness, and the composite cannons mounted on their left arms began to charge with a low, gathering hum, power pooling for a devastating release. At the decisive moment, the First Legion swung to encircle the Hive City, closing the noose to annihilate the Randan within. The Nur Auxiliary Army split into two bodies, one to reinforce the siege, the other to cut off any fleeing forces and secure the approaches. In the command center, Adam issued orders with clipped precision. 50,000 men will form the Siege Legion. The Night Watch and the Siege Army will operate together. 10 destroyer warrior brothers will be attached, ready to reinforce the Mortal Legion at a moment's notice. The remaining forces will hold the line against the Randan slave army and blunt their final, desperate onslaught. The Supreme Commander's orders were short and decisive. All the finer points were left to the commanders of the Mortal Legions to work out. Atum put the orders into motion. As Doom's representative and emissary of the Supreme Primarch, King Nawik of Nur, he had the authority and understood exactly what the Mortal Legion needed. Nur's auxiliary forces far outclassed the Imperial troops in military technology, which only made rigorous training more essential. After a pause, Atum gave the go-ahead. Unlock all Siege Legion armaments. He hesitated only long enough to weigh the consequences, then permitted the auxiliary army to employ everything at its disposal. They were not facing ordinary mortal levies, but Randan elites on par with the Astartes. These were not irregular opponents demanding restraint. They were terrifying, high-value targets. Using overwhelming firepower would not degrade the troops' combat effectiveness. It was the sensible, necessary course of action. With Supreme Command's authorization, every function of the power armor systems came online, and the Mortal Auxiliary Army swung into action to flank the Hive City. 50,000 mortal soldiers stepped forward, fell into formation, and poured out from the defensive lines to begin siege operations. They were accompanied by automated combat units at a ratio of 4-to-1, roughly 200,000 machines in total. Mortals had limited cognitive bandwidth. Even after rigorous training, a soldier could reliably coordinate only 2 automated units at once, the other 2 kept in reserve. Those who could handle 3 or 4 were rare, exceptional talents. The black-gray Nur Mortal Legion moved out in armored transports toward the Hive City. Clad in power armor, the Nur Auxiliary were not daunted by long marches. 10-odd kilometers was nothing to them. As the Legion advanced, it kept pace with the First Legion, timing its movement so both wings would reach the battlefield beside the Hive City together. Adam watched the auxiliary army's departure, then turned his attention back to the map. Adam kept shaking his head. The Randan slaves in the wilderness had closed in on them from every direction, mounting a last, desperate assault. But after the long fighting, the Randans were spent, weak, starving, and hollowed out by siege. Non-combat attrition had outstripped battlefield deaths. Even before the final offensive, cannibalism had broken out among them. The slave army turned on itself, scavenging corpses on the field. Eating infants and women had become disturbingly common. Help them find release, Atum sighed. He wasn't indulging sentimentality. He simply wanted to spare his fellow humans further suffering. Behind the Nur base, 10 missile launchers, each with 10 tubes, lifted their racks and swung into position, aiming in different directions. Every tube held a high-yield nuclear warhead. 100 or so warheads was more than enough to wipe out the slave forces. The Randans, attrition tactics meant nothing against a well-prepared regular army. Then the salvo went up. 100 nuclear missiles climbed on pillars of flame, scattering outward like a flock of firebirds toward their assigned detonation points. The nuclear bombs detonated at once. Their searing light ripped through the clouds, and for a heartbeat, the world turned white. From the rim of the blast, the human base looked as if it were planted in a forest of giant mushrooms, lending the scene an almost surreal, fairy tale quality. Tremors from the explosions ran continuously through the ground. The earth beneath them shuddered. Autumn's face was unreadable. A holographic readout hovered before him. 99.99% of the wilderness's servitor armies had been destroyed. When the blast impact dissipates, send the cavalry to wipe up the remaining forces, he ordered coolly, his gaze fixed on the damage figures. After tens of thousands of years of refinement, atomic weapons had become devastating and inexpensive. Radiation was kept within safe thresholds, so troops could be sent forward for the cleanup. Spurred by the barrage, the First Legion burst through the breached walls and poured into the Xeno-infested Hive City. Ruins lay everywhere, and enemies lurked around every corner. "Lolos!" Grandmaster Urian roared, his voice magnified by the helmet's sound array and reverberating through the ruined streets. "Where are you?" He stood trembling with fury, but there was no answer. His power sword hissed as it spun up and drove down through Randan Elite, the blade's disintegration field consuming the creatures it struck. Behind him, his guard advanced in Terminator power armor, shields and swords flashing, their arm-mounted bolt guns staccatoing without pause, killing Xenos and mortals alike. Black-armored warriors poured through the breach in the city wall and surged forward like starving wolves. The Astartes' longswords drank deep, hungry for Xenos' blood, each stroke an oath to avenge fallen brothers. The First Legion needed no mortal auxiliaries for this assault. 30,000 Space Marines were more than enough. They required no human armies to break the enemy. "Lolos, you alien bastard!" Urian's ceramite boot crunched over the rubble as his shout cut through the smoke of battle. "I know you're still alive. Come out and face me." The Grandmaster's oculars swept the field. The Randan formation hadn't broken, but the way the soldiers moved betrayed growing panic. Beneath their crude disguise, the chain of command still functioned. He let a bitter sneer twist his mouth, the low hum of his plasma pistol blending with the distant roar of bolters into a savage symphony. His taunts were as much hatred as tactic, meant to flush the enemy commander from hiding. "Where is your arrogance?" he demanded. His longsword danced, cleaving a Randan until it hung like a streak of blood and torn flesh. Urian ground his ceramite boot down into the alien's abdominal plating and stared into the creature's trembling monitor face. "You want me to lick 10,000 boots?" he mocked, feigning confusion, then leaned in close and roared, "I'm right here. Where are you?" He brought the plasma pistol up, the barrel's glow painting the ruined stones, then swept his gaze over the ruined square, searching, waiting for an answer. The battlefield was a roar of bolter fire and searing plasma, pierced by the high, animal shrieks of the Randan and the thunderous roars of Legion warriors. Deep in a ruined building, in a hastily arranged command center, the Randan war leader Lolos was boiling with rage. Lolos spat a clumsy imitation of human speech, an ugly string of insults and mixed idioms that echoed through the command room. Through its bionic eyes, the war leader watched the enemy commander on the feed and heard the human's taunts. It dared not answer. Its bio-armor vented hot fumes as if it could not contain the shame. The humiliation tasted bitter, and Lolos swallowed it down. It understood what the enemy wanted, to bait it into the open and smash the command structure. It could not afford to be lured out. With the space fleet destroyed and the underground strike failed, there was nowhere left to retreat. Its elite warriors would only be ground down by a siege. Forcing itself calm, Lolos continued issuing orders, determined to command until the very last moment. Ultimately, a vile alien. After a long, silent pause, Urian shook his head sadly. Utterly without courage or dignity, less than the slaves who still fight for their lives. He lined up the shot, preparing to punch a plasma bolt through the Randan's bioarmor and vaporize the ugly, brain-like thing beneath his boot. "No need to rush," the creature answered, but in Lolos's voice, "I will make you lick boots." Urian's reply came like a blade. He amplified his voice to full power. "Still hiding behind your kin and spouting bravado?" There was no time for rebuttal. Humiliated and exposed, the Randan beneath his foot was erased with a single shot. The psychological effect was immediate. Morale along the Randan lines began to crumble. Questions spread about the war leader's courage, doubts about their willingness to die, fears about their own strength. Against the high spirits of the First Legion, those cracks proved fatal. The Randan front collapsed in an instant, and countless war vehicles poured forward, racing through the ruined Hive City. The Legion's vehicles weren't just machines, they were extensions of the men who sat in them. Each chassis keyed directly into a pilot's power armor through a spinal interface, the nervous system bridging human and hull. Once linked, pilot and vehicle moved as one. Neural commands tightened posture, refined balance, and unleashed the vehicle's full combat potential with a precision no purely mechanical control system could match. Around that spine of integrated war machinery, Legion warriors sealed the perimeter. The vehicle's powerful scanners swept the streets, clearing alleys and rooftops of threats, while armored hulls doubled as forward strongpoints. From those anchors, the Legion established local fire superiority, stitching overlapping fields of suppression that swept Randan elite units aside in a net-like dragnet. The First Legion moved with particular efficiency. Years of doctrine and practice showed in their combined arms maneuvers, infantry and armor operating in tight coordination to steadily compress the Randan space to live and fight. Every advance was methodical, every step measured, leaving the enemy fewer places to stand. Nur's corps advanced at a different tempo, slower but ruthlessly disciplined. When the sonic cannon blew a gap in the defenses, Nur's troops poured through with textbook precision. They seized the hubs of the Hive City, turning intersections and transit nodes into fortified anchors and tuning the line with automated combat mechs at their flanks. Two of those mechs walked 2 meters ahead of each warrior, a pair of metal hunters that synchronized their sensors and targeting feeds directly with the soldier's armor. Nur's mortals used a special variant of power armor, a neurosynaptic suit that latched onto the wearer's spinal interface. The connection wasn't merely data, it was sensation and intent, a feedback loop that made soldier and suit react as if they were a single organism. In that mesh of flesh, wire, and algorithm, the distinction between human and machine blurred, and the Hive City felt it, a deliberate, inexorable advance that tightened like a vice. Power armor like this wasn't as tough as Space Marine armor, but it had two big advantages. Mortals could wear it, and it came loaded with combat systems that turned ordinary soldiers into coordinated weapons. The men organized themselves into triads, 3 specialists to a team, each triad managing 6 automated combat mechs. 3 such triads combined into a squad, overlapping their fields of fire so they could cover each other from every angle. Vanguard Squad, advance. The command crackled through their helmets. The squad commander's voice was routed into every HUD. Vanguard acknowledged. The lead element moved out immediately, slipping forward to seize the approaching intersection and its tactical high ground. A moment later, the helmet pinged. Enemy detected. The HUD marked the positions and pushed the contacts to every member of the squad. Slave troops crouched in the buildings lining the street, hidden in prepared firing positions and waiting for anyone foolish enough to step into the kill zone. Their ambush didn't go unnoticed. The automated mech's bioscanners picked up heat signatures and biological traces inside the structures. Cover. The Vanguard made the practiced hand signals, dropping to concealment as the mechs jerked into action. The machines rotated, sensors sweeping, and weapons settling into suppressive arcs, while the soldiers pulled back behind rubble and shadow, protected by metal and the mapped intelligence feeding their helmets. Beware of Randan elite soldiers. They may be nearby. The captain pulled up the intel, his mind clear despite the gunfire snapping around him. As the column pushed forward, more and more reports from Randan encounters flowed in. At first, the aliens had been openly contemptuous of mortals, charging straight at human lines. In those opening clashes, the automated combat mechs tore the attackers to pieces, and the survivors melted back into the shadows. What made the Randan dangerous was their bioarmor. It was unusually resilient, able to change temperature to match its surroundings, and even provide a degree of visual camouflage. From hiding places, they would suddenly erupt with personal shields up and lightning-fast movement, then vanish again, striking in bursts that took a heavy toll. The Mortal Legion were neither Night Watch nor Space Marines. Their reaction times simply couldn't match the aliens. The Siege Legion changed tactics on the fly. Consulting the war codes of King Nowik, they abandoned open-field tactics and transitioned to systematic urban warfare. Guerrilla fighters? The captain barked. Fine, so are we. Sweep every block, secure a solid rear, methodically advance and bring this fight to them. Automated combat mechs, spread out, adopt cover formation. Don't let them get in close. The captain barked the order, but it felt hollow in his mouth. This street was too narrow for a proper spread. The mechs were packed in shoulder to shoulder and couldn't open up the way doctrine required. He watched them try anyway, treads grinding as each automated unit attempted to gain a sliver of space. Before the humans could finish reacting, the sensors screamed an alert. 2 piles of rubble at the intersection shuddered and fell away, shedding their disguise. Enemy confirmed, Randan, Overlord, and Elite. The mech systems reported in a flat, instantaneous stream. Targeting arrays snapped to life, and the various mounted weapons swung into position. The Randan moved like living lightning. Their multi-jointed biolimbs uncoiled and struck with blinding speed. In the opening skirmish, both sides tested the other, but it quickly became clear to the Randan why they had to prevent the spread. If the machines and humans managed to establish overlapping fields of fire, the mech's concentrated volleys could shred bioarmor in seconds. Stopping the formation from forming was now their immediate priority. The Randan Overlord moved with blinding speed, launching a counterattack before the machines even had a chance to aim. A grotesque face on the bioarmor's abdomen let out a piercing screech that rolled through the field. The sonic roar stunned the nearby human soldiers. The Nur troops staggered, dazed, and momentarily unfocused. Using the opening, the Randan Overlord drove its omnidirectional legs and darted away from its original position. The Elite trailed its movements instantly. Their timing had to be flawless, because the machines had already locked on. Within half a second, the automated guns spat crimson beams where the Randan had been, burning a molten crater into the ground. Had they stayed a moment longer, the machine's high-power lasers would have cut them down. Instead, Randan raised its bionic arms and fired in perfect coordination. Plasma bolts lanced out and tore 2 nearby combat mechs apart in an instant. Against the sluggish reactions of the humans, the machines were by far the greater danger. A flash of lightning split the sky, and the captain reacted with practiced calm. Eliminate the Randan Elite, he ordered. The Overlord is beyond our capability. Do not engage it. He spoke from a distance, so the sonic shock that rolled through the battlefield barely touched him. Closer in, the human troops, already rattled, couldn't anticipate the Randan's next move. The instant the order was given, the Elite's curved blade descended without pity, cutting down the vanguard squad. Everything else snapped into motion. 8 automated combat mechs surged forward, pouring out a withering curtain of fire that forced the Randan Overlord back. Even so, 2 of those mechs were lost in the exchange. The survivors, both human crews and remaining machines, concentrated every weapon on the nearby Randan Elite. The Elite tried to pull away, but it was too late. The mech's laser arrays locked it down, while several heavy-caliber plasma rounds hammered its shield, finally shattering the defenses. Farther off, 4 more mechs exploded as the Overlord's speed and ferocity took their toll. Up close, the 3 captains raised their electromagnetic rifles. The targeting systems snapped to the same mark, the trapped Randan Elite warrior. The Overlord surged forward again, raising its butcher's blade toward another squad. Die, you filthy alien, it snarled. With grim resolve, one of the soldiers squeezed the trigger. The rifle hummed with electromagnetic energy and unleashed a barrage of tiny projectiles, hundreds of rounds that could home in within a short range. With targeting locked, every shot found its mark. The elite warrior's bio-armor was shredded in an instant. The Randan inside, its true form, burst out of the wreckage, terrified and trying to flee, but the dense volley of fire tore it apart. Before the auxiliary army could recover from the psychic shock, the Randan overlord, at the death of its kin, charged forward to avenge it. Its butcher's blade swung down, and then a slit of blue light flashed, driving the overlord back. "Alien, your opponent is me," someone called. Down the street, a night watch stood there, spear in hand. So much to do, my body and mind are exhausted. 2:10, Dark Night Confrontation. The night watch stood in the middle of the ruined street, surrounded by scattered rocks and twisted steel. He was a veteran in steel-colored power armor, a dimensional spear balanced in his hands. His voice, low and gravelly, rolled through the smoke and wreckage as he twirled the spear in a casual flourish. "Your opponent is me," he growled. "You alien scum!" The squad's automaton picked up the presence of the Randan overlord and immediately flagged it as beyond its capacity to engage. It sent an urgent call for high-tier combat support. Before the unit could be wiped out, backup arrived. The reinforcer was a tall, imposing warrior whose presence alone put the Randan overlord on edge. He stood a few inches taller than a space marine, his power armor oddly beautiful, part antiquity, part advanced technology. A faintly glowing spear rested in his hands, held with the relaxed grace of someone taking a stroll through a shattered garden rather than preparing for battle. "Who are you?" the Randan overlord asked, a ripple of unease passing over the folds of its brain-like main body. Its bio-armor registered nothing hostile, but instinct screamed warning. The human before it was no ordinary opponent. The Randan overlord obeyed that inner alarm, pushing its bionic vision to maximum and locking every sensor on the man. "Night Watch, the Watcher before dawn," the human announced, raising his spear and taking a step forward, then added with a cold edge, "and your high-hanging Death Star." At the movement, the overlord sprang back, like a startled toad. Inside its suit, the creature's neural core flooded, its mind stretched to the absolute limit. Through its psychic perception, the Night Watch's emotions read as calm as still water, and yet as heavy as iron. The single step didn't change the man's demeanor, but it sent the overlord's biological alarm spiking. Its biopower armor shuddered, as if shouldering an invisible crushing weight. "Ultimately, a cowardly alien driven by instinct," Night Watch said, shaking his head. His voice was deep and steady, calm as an ancient well, rife with contempt. He strode forward, lifted a hand, and bellowed, "Auxiliary army, withdraw!" Relief spread across the faces of the Nur-auxiliary troops. The arrival of comparable firepower meant a real chance at survival. Even those who preached bravery in death welcomed the sudden hope of living. This was not their fight to win. The Randan overlord was an entity beyond mere mortals. The squad leader hauled the survivors to their feet, gathered the functioning automatons, and pulled the group back to safety. The Randan overlord, furious at the human remnants preparing to leave, moved to give chase, until the newcomer's voice sliced through the air. "I advise you not to get any ideas about them," it said, cold and low. Before its omnidirectional legs could spring forward, the overlord heard the warning again. Its bio-armor stiffened. Instinct held it motionless. Inside, it forced a calm rationale. "I'm only narrowing my focus, concentrating on the human warrior." The Randan, bred and bred again to consider itself superior to humans, would never admit to feeling fear before a fight. Even so, the warning had planted something it refused to name. The alien dropped its plasma gun and strode over to one of its elite warriors to take up a melee weapon. The Night Watch did not intervene this time. He watched in silence, waiting for the auxiliary army to finish withdrawing. The Randan overlord activated its disintegration field. 2 bone scimitars snapped into its hands and began to glow with a crackling, electric light. The weapon seemed to empower it. When it turned back to the Night Watch, its psychic aura brimmed with killing intent. A savage caw tore out of the overlord, and a visible sonic blast swept down the street, whipping the mottled old flags into a frenzy. The creature's abdomen vibrated, sending out an ear-splitting keening. The sound wave leveled the pavement, rusted steel beams splintered and collapsed, and gravel flew like shrapnel, yet the Night Watch did not move a muscle. He was a veteran of the Truth War. His heart was hard as stone, and his will unshakable. The Overlord's fearsome roar didn't even make him raise an eyebrow. The Night Watch didn't underestimate it. He poured every scrap of psychic power into his defenses, bracing against the alien's bizarre neural assault. Even as an academy cadet, the War College had hammered one lesson into him. When facing an opponent, you fight with everything you have. The nearby mortals fell back as he steadied his spear. With the weapon resting in his hand, he unleashed a dimensional beam. The light speed strike and his own reaction speed, combined, left the Randan Overlord no chance to dodge. The creature's psychic aura flared in a furious roar as one of its omnidirectional legs was sliced clean off by the attack. It had already abandoned its ranged armament, apparently assuming the human wanted a fair, close-quarters duel. Now, its remaining omni-legs locked and thrust outward. The Overlord lunged forward, desperate to close the gap and put itself beyond the reach of further long-range fire. The beam was strange and terrifying. Shields did nothing against it, the light severing whatever it struck, as if there were no armor at all. "So instead of running, you come to me?" the Night Watch said, eyes fixed on the Randan Overlord as it bore down. The alien's mobility was astonishing. Its omnidirectional legs crawled up the buildings along the street like a spider clinging to walls. Its movements were blindingly fast, its evasive maneuvers fluid and precise. The Night Watch raised his spear. He struck the creature cleanly, but he held back. He brought the spear across his body, assumed a defensive stance, and prepared for close-quarters fighting. He did it deliberately. The Night Watch was a seasoned warrior and tactician. He knew battles were often only the prelude to larger wars. The real slaughter had yet to come. Even if this enemy were killed, the location of the Randan homeworld and the full extent of Imperium space remained shrouded in uncertainty. The Imperium of Man knew very little about the Randan, while the Randan already knew far more about the Imperium. The Randan Overlord before him was the first Overlord the Nur Auxiliary Army had encountered, and the Night Watch wanted to gather whatever intelligence he could to prepare for the next war. The Randan Overlord unleashed a psychic shriek, "Human, die!" and dropped from the air the instant it decided. It raised its bone blades high and, using the weight of the fall, tried to cleave the human in two. It was a brutal, mountain-splitting strike, but the Night Watch saw 1,000 flaws. The Overlord's guard was wide open. Its lower limbs and the area around its chest and abdomen were exposed. One well-placed spear thrust could have killed it. Even if he did nothing, simply holding his weapon upright would let the alien impale itself. He shook his head inwardly and held his spear horizontally, using the shaft to meet the downward blow. Clang! The alien's bone blades slammed against the shaft and rang out a clear, ringing note, sharp and almost pleasant, and the attack changed instantly. The shaft, specially treated to resist the Overlord's disintegration field, took the force. With a quick downward pull and a snap release of his right hand, the Night Watch drove the butt of his spear into the pavement. The bone blade skidded off, crashed to the ground, and split the bluestone under it. The Randan Overlord's ferocity surged again. Its blades swung for a horizontal sweep, but at that close range, the twin bone blades couldn't build the arc they needed. The spear shaft stopped them cold, leaving the Overlord unable to drive home the strike. Frustrated, it spun up its omnidirectional legs and shifted into the optimal close combat range, bringing its blades back to the spear to deny the long weapon any room to work. The decision paid off. The twin bone blades whirled with terrifying power, crackling with lightning as hay rained slashes toward the human. Metal rang on metal. The blades moved in almost millimeter-perfect arcs, each collision whipping a gust of wind through the fight. The gusts carried the blade's force like a punch riding behind a hurricane. "I understand," Night Watch said, exhaling as his spear vibrated from the impact and shoved the twin blades aside. The Overlord backed up a step and rebalanced itself at a distance that let it strike quickly, while also denying Night Watch the advantage of reach. Its bioarmor breathed visibly, a heat management cycle pulsing through the plating, the kind of reprieve only necessary when the armor was running a high-intensity output. "What do you understand?" the Overlord asked, its voice edged with eager curiosity. During the rapid assault, Every full-power strike the Randan threw was deflected with ease by the human warrior. After just one round of sparring, the alien felt its mind go dull and its bio-armor needed to cool. By contrast, the human who had taken those blows looked perfectly composed, showing no sign of fatigue. I understand now. Aliens are little more than brutes, without any real martial skill, the Night Watch said, shaking his head. The contempt in his voice was plain. In the brief, intense exchange, the Night Watch had learned the truth about the Randan's style. Its attacks could be terrifying to watch, but they contained no real technique. The Randan relied entirely on the superior performance of its bioarmor to win fights. Against creatures with inferior capabilities, that approach produced a crushing, one-sided victory. But against an equal, a trained warrior of comparable level, a space marine for example, the lack of skill would be fatal. Given enough close, even fights, a competent opponent would exploit the gaps and kill it. Martial prowess? The Randan overlord thought, as if he'd misheard, or the human had spoken the wrong word. It reoriented, neural tentacles unfurling from its body as an endless surge of power hummed through its bioarmor. What else could this be but martial might? I have learned of your race's fragility. You may die now. The Night Watch spoke almost conversationally, as if they were discussing something mundane rather than fighting for their lives. He dropped into a stance, holding his spear horizontally with his right hand and, with his left, made a taunting, open-handed gesture at the Randan. "Come and die," he said. The Randan bristled at the provocation. It lashed out its bone blades and screeched, furious at being challenged by a human. The Xenos charged, teeth bared and claws flashing. The Watch only shook his head, a trace of regret in the movement. To him, the creature was nothing more than a savage armed with sharp implements and loud threats, bluster without the restraint or weight that true power carries. His eyes narrowed as he hunted for the beast's faults. Then he struck. "Say hello to death for me," he muttered, and drove his spear forward. As the Randan brought down a cleaving bone blade, the Watch used his right hand to parry the blow. His left hand moved so fast, it was a blur. The Randan's core constricted suddenly, a coldness like the smell of death rising from the depths of its being. Its bionic eye picked up a tiny, unexpected motion from the human. What was that left hand doing? No single hand could have fully blocked the Randan's cleaving strike, yet the slightest easing of its force, a breath of an instant, was all the opening the Night Watch needed. His left hand had already come up from his waist, drawing a pistol. The muzzle rose, locked on the Randan's main body. Through the bionic eye, the Randan zoomed in. To its sensors, the barrel's upward sweep looked agonizingly slow, like amber solidifying mid-air, and yet it was impossible to evade. "I am your harbinger of death," the Night Watch said, then squeezed the trigger. A cross-shaped beam spat from the muzzle. The cutting pistol, charged with null crystal, lanced through the bio-armor at near-light speed and sheared straight into the Randan overlord within. The armor went wild, systems failing as its power bled away. The Night Watch didn't relax. He fell back out of killing range, while the left-hand pistol barked again and again, keeping the ruined machine from rallying. He fired a few more rounds into the cockpit to make absolutely sure the Randan overlord was dead, then picked off the bio-armor's joints until its grasping limbs fell away. Methodical and silent, he finished the job and ran a quick mental inventory of the creature's armament, more dangerous in pieces than it had first seemed. Its weakness had been obvious. The bio-armor was brutally effective, but it was still an external shell. The Xenos fought by function and mass rather than by technique. They relied on numerical superiority and specialized systems instead of refined martial skill. If the Overlord had combined those systems with tactical finesse, using ranged weapons to threaten and pin, a melee weapon for decisive blows and the bionic tentacle blades for constant harassment, it might have lasted a few seconds longer. Instead, the Xenos' superficial approach made them forget the finer points of combat and left openings to exploit. With the Night Watch holding the front, the newly arrived auxiliary army squad slipped in behind them, filled the gap, and pushed the advance forward. The mortals gave a brief nod. There was no need for ceremony on a battlefield. He glanced once at the mortal soldiers, then turned and moved off to patrol the other front lines. Within seconds of the engagement, the auxiliary army's follow-up units were on the field, moving with a speed that testified to the Legion commander's coordination. The Nur Legion pushed forward like a living city wall, steadily compressing the Randan's territory and squeezing their defenders into ever smaller pockets. As the advance continued, the mortals ran into increasing numbers of Randan warriors, including high-ranking units such as a Randan overlord. Through unrelenting combat, the auxiliary army began to learn the Xenos' tactics and weaknesses, adapting its approach as it went. Against elite Randan, the mortals relied on what advantage they had: overwhelming firepower. Automated combat systems suppressed enemy movement with sustained volleys, while human units concentrated their fire using automatic targeting, creating brief windows where a successful assault was possible. Those lessons were hard-won and paid for in lives. The gap in capability was stark. Randan elites were overwhelmingly superior to mortals, roughly the difference between a space marine and an ordinary human. The two were not comparable. No matter how skilled an elite mortal might be, they remained human and could not hope to defeat a superhuman soldier in close quarters. That was the fundamental, unbridgeable difference. Before the mortal could even react, the elite warrior had already fired and holstered his weapon. Across the field, the First Legion, 30,000 Astartes deployed in relentless formation, surged forward, cutting the Randan down in droves. When a legion of Space Marines assaults, nothing in the galaxy can withstand it. No force could hold before the black-armored warriors. The Randan had only just fallen back to their defensive line when the First Legion was already among them. Behind the defenders, there were no survivors. Buildings swept clean, Xenos contamination purged. The Randan suffered not only the physical onslaught of the Imperium Space Marines, but the psychic contamination that emanated from them as well. "Lolos, you coward! I've reached the outer edge of your defenses. Are you still going to hide?" Urian bellowed. He stood beside a rhino-armored transport. A loudspeaker mounted on its roof broadcast the Grand Master's words across the battlefield. The Randan launched an initial strike to smash the loudspeaker, but the attackers were cut down by the Terminators posted to guard the vehicle. After relentless assaults, the First Legion reached the perimeter of the Randan command post, the Xenos' last line of defense. "Wait," the Grand Master ordered, and for the first time the Legion slowed its pace. "Don't rush. Probe and grind them down. Hold here until our allies arrive." The order was unorthodox. Doctrine favored a single decisive breach to strike at the enemy's heart. Still, the Legion obeyed. They drew back into the cover of shattered walls and rubble, advancing in careful, measured bounds to bleed the Xenos' strength rather than risk a costly all-out charge. If Nur's forces had not been coming to support them, the First Legion would have taken grievous losses, and the Grand Master himself might already have fallen. But they remembered the debt. The honor of tearing down the Randan command post, they believed, belonged to both legions. Waiting was not cowardice but respect, a deliberate tactical acknowledgement of Nur's aid. The Randan were effectively starved of options. Even if they tried to reform their lines, once Nur's legion closed the ring around them, the defenses would be far easier to shatter. 100 custodes and destroyer warriors, they were a wall. The humans faltered under the onslaught. The Randan used the pause to pull their lines back into a fighting formation, bracing for one last, desperate stand. Urian Bendigard, a raw roar, laced with a psychic aftershock, rolled across the shattered ground. Warleader Lolos at last strode into view in towering bio-armor, his fury written plainly on his face. "Are you ready to die?" he thundered. Urian's reply came louder still. The Grand Master's voice poured from the loudspeaker, drowning the warleader's shout. He vaulted up onto the roof of the Rhino, his boots finding purchase on a metal lip, and with perfect theatrical calm seized the initiative. "Are you ready to use your tentacles to wipe my boots clean?" A hideous, contagious laughter burst from the Legion warriors at his side. Their morale crackled like dry tinder. They jeered without restraint at the Xenos invader. "Despicable tongue," Lolos snarled, vents along his armor hissing hot steam. But the words were swallowed by the speaker's blast. Urian pretended to cock an ear toward him, and called back, amused. "What was that?" "Speak up. Can't hear you." "I didn't hear you." The Legion warriors howled with laughter, a savage, triumphant sound. Today they would take revenge and humiliate the Xenos. Gunfire rattled around them as the assault pressed in. Along the First Legion's left flank, Randan troops were falling back in disorder. Their personal shields were collapsing under fire, their bio-armor riddled with breaches. Men dragged, smoking, torn suits of armor behind them as they retreated. The Grand Master swept his gaze across the fighting. For a heartbeat, he expected to see the Custodes, or the Destroyer Warriors. Instead, his eyes fell on a squad of mortal auxiliary assault troops. His expression tightened as realization dawned. Nur's mortal auxiliary army, not the elite detachments, was driving the main attack. The Custodes, Destroyer Warriors, and the Nor World's Night Watch were serving only as support in the encirclement. Highly skilled, but not the spearhead. The mortal auxiliaries could not close ground as fast as the Astartes, yet they were far stronger than any auxiliary forces of the Imperium. The bulk of the mortal auxiliary army came into view within sight of the First Legion. They moved with swift purpose, seizing cover and planting firing positions with practiced efficiency. Even with superhuman warriors among them, the mortals showed no slip in discipline, no wasted motion, no disorder. The legionnaires watched with muted respect. This was not a ragged militia, but the rising of a formidable force. Only after the mortals had taken their posts and assumed combat stances did the other contingents reveal themselves from behind. A destroyer warrior strode forward bearing a battle standard stamped with the Gene Father's sigil, a crimson device set against a field of black, a promise of ruin. Nearby the Night Watch lifted their own banner, the Nor World's emblem rendered in bright yellow on a deep blue field. A gladiolus, encircled by laurels, spoke of unyielding spirit, victory, and conquest. At the rear of the mortal lines, the Custodes carried the imperial double-headed eagle high. They moved slowly, the banner held like a remnant of solemn authority, and their eyes traced the Randan positions hewn into the collapsed ruins ahead. The ruined rooftops and shattered walls now bristled with prepared defenses. The scene was terrible and orderly, a tableau of ruin readied for war. A transmission crackled over the channel. Commander Atom's order came through sharp and uncompromising. Annihilate the filthy Xenos. Mortals, break through the defiled one's lines. A roar went up along the Nur front. A black-armored warrior surged from the ranks, moving with terrifying speed. 8,000 Randan soldiers stood between him and the objective. Their solid defensive line had to be pierced. Leading the assault, the destroyer warrior threw himself into the enemy, wielding a double-headed dimensional greatsword and gripping the hilt in the center. The twin blades blurred into afterimages that formed a shifting ripple-like shield swallowing the Randan plasma fire. "I am John Wick. I am a destroyer warrior," he bellowed, ferocity pouring out of him. Those who passed the destroyer warrior's soul trial often grew aloof and cold, distant, almost inhuman. John Wick was not like that. He was simply the most savage of warriors. A thunder emblem marked his black armor. He had fought in the Unification Wars, taking part in the purge of the Thunder Warriors. Translator's note: I finished my tasks today and will be able to post more frequently. 212. Kill the Warlord. John Wick, called the sharpest of the berserkers, came at them like a living storm. His double-bladed greatsword was a blur of light, dimensional blades slicing through the air and snapping aside whatever the Randan threw at him. He moved with terrifying purpose. Each step was an accusation, each swing a promise. The Randan panicked. They focused every weapon, every psychic probe they had on that black phantom, desperate to stop him before he reached their lines. To their collective mind, the man charging at them no longer felt entirely human. Through their telepathic senses, he was a burning inferno of rage, so intense and so palpable that his killing intent seared their thoughts. None of them wanted to meet him face to face. They feared his presence would scorch their minds like a sudden, blinding sun. That fear split their attention, and the mortal auxiliary army behind John took full advantage. Automated combat droids surged forward in an endless stream, suppressing the Randan frontline with overwhelming firepower and forcing their heads down. The more the droids poured forward, the less the Randan dared to expose themselves. When the assault reached critical mass, a host of four-legged combat droids thundered in. They wove themselves into an almost impenetrable web of fire, each chassis bristling with 4 specially designed large-caliber weapons. The automated units fought in tandem with the infantry, providing relentless heavy support that kept the Randon pinned and buying John every inch he needed. Large-caliber electromagnetic cannons, heavy supercharged lasers, scorching incinerator beams, and plasma armor piercers. 4 weapon systems combined and pushed to the limits of what the automated combat droids could carry. The machines stood only about half a man's height, but apart from their chassis, their upper bodies were nothing but weapons, barrels, emitters, and cooling conduits packed shoulder to shoulder. When they opened up from the neurlines, the battlefield temperature spiked in an instant. High-energy rays overlapped and braided into lethal patterns that cut down Randan elite warriors with brutal efficiency. The Nur-mortal auxiliary, caught earlier in the maze of broken terrain and ambushed by the Randan, had been driven into tight positions. Trapped and furious, the Xenos turned those clustered emplacements into firing platforms and unleashed everything they had to avenge the fallen. Urian watched in muted astonishment. The Grandmaster felt the data like a warrior feels a blade. He measured the fire density and the pattern of suppression with a lifetime of combat instinct. His conclusion was grim and simple. Even Space Marines, for all their speed and reflexes, would gain no advantage once surrounded by that unrelenting curtain of fire. Their reaction times might be faster, but a continuous, overlapping volume of high-energy fire would make it impossible for them to lift their heads and fight back effectively. "Charge!" Urian roared, the first to break from the Legion's line as the final assault on the Randan began. Any delay would have been fatal. John Wick plunged into the Randan ranks like a ghost, his silhouette a blur as he cut down Xenos with every rotation of his double-bladed greatsword. He howled, a beast among enemies. "Abominations! Yield to me!" Mid-swing, the weapon split clean down the middle, the hilt separating into 2 single-handed greatswords, and he began a lethal, whirling dance through the Randan. Around him, the remnants of Randan bioweapons collapsed and burned. Wherever he passed, a tide of death rolled over the enemy, and the Randan faltered beneath his individual fury. With that vanguard tearing a path, the auxiliary army surged up behind them. Automated combat droids were used as living shields, while troops advanced under a ceaseless curtain of suppressing fire. Within 2 minutes, the first droid clambered onto the Randan position and was destroyed on impact, but more machines followed immediately, their 4 mechanical legs pounding forward with inexorable steps onto the contested ground. The Randan fought desperately, but their plasma rifles were already starting to falter. Continuous firing made the weapons overheat and slow. For the first time, they felt the same hopelessness they had once inflicted on others. Accustomed to victory by sheer numbers, an army of slaves that needed no strategy, only to overwhelm and crush, now they watched cold, emotionless machines methodically roll forward and tear their lines apart. Retreat was the only option, and even that was gone. The machine's relentless, orderly advance rang like a death knell for the Randan. Alongside the mechanical tide, the Allied forces advanced in a controlled, coordinated way. The Night Watch and the auxiliary army moved up together, matching the mortals' steady pace instead of charging headlong, providing measured support. The gleaming Emperor's custodians were interspersed through the mortal ranks, not launching reckless assaults, but working with the slow, deliberate push of the front. The destroyer warriors hung back at the rear, holding the line and ready to stop any unforeseen counterattacks. Every superhuman warrior there understood what this battle meant. The mortals were at its center. The mortal auxiliary army needed a decisive victory to win honor for themselves and to forge a true military spirit. Even the First Legion had slowed. Its Space Marines were tied up supporting the mortal offensive. Only a small assault team pushed on toward the Randan command post. Urian, flanked by Terminators, strode forward with a force field shield strapped to his left arm, heading straight for the target he'd come for. From the Randan line, he thundered a challenge. "Randan war leader Lolos." "Urian Bendigard," the Xeno ranks answered. This time Lolos himself replied with a high, savage shriek. Amid the din of battle, they called to one another and picked up each other's trail. When their eyes met, the two gazes collided like steel, sending sparks into the air. Warleader Lolos loomed tall in orange-red bio-armor, twin bone blades held ready, his multi-jointed bionic legs whirring as he pivoted and surged forward. Urian, all black power armor and silent resolve, shield at the ready, boots crushing fractured concrete beneath him, met the charge without hesitation. "I'll have you buried with me," Lolos wailed, swinging his two bone blades in a wide arc aimed at the Grandmaster's neck. Urian ducked beneath the sweep, slid to Lolos's left, and drove his power sword forward. "Buried with a foul creature like you? I have no such interest." The power sword's disintegration field flared and bit into the right flank of Lolos's bio-armor, reducing the functioning organs inside to raw molecules. Lolos screamed. The pain system feedback sent white-hot stabs through his cerebral cortex. He gritted his teeth, twisted his upper body, and used the momentum to counter with another sweeping strike of his blades. The bone weapons slammed against Urian's shield with a metallic clang. A jolt of pain shot through Urian's left hand, where he gripped the shield, and the force knocked him off his feet. He hit the gravel hard, armor grinding and scraping as he slid several meters before coming to a stop. Urian was on his feet again almost immediately, dusting his plating. Lolos raised his blades and surged after him, his omnidirectional legs moving jerkily and out of sync. The previous thrust had crippled a vital section of his bio-armor. Urian looked ragged, but he was not mortally wounded. He sneered, "A beast with no skill," then surged forward. He closed the distance to Lolos and drove his left-hand shield up to its full height, stopping the bone blade at close range to halt its momentum. The shield rang with a crisp impact as it took the downward chop. The blow's force was noticeably blunted. Simultaneously, his power sword met a sweeping bone blade. Lolos's raw strength made the longsword shudder. Urian's mind worked fast. He ever so slightly angled the blade inward to divert the incoming energy. Bone and steel ped together, their disintegrating fields tearing at one another, sparks cracking like lightning. Dropping his profile, Urian drew back the shield and longsword just in time to evade Lolos's double strike. He slid forward in a single, fluid motion and thrust his power sword home, driving the blade through the bio-armor at the waist. The tip appeared out of Lolos's lower back. "You damnable rat!" Lolos screamed, a keening of agony that rolled across the battlefield and sent the warleader's guards on edge. But every Randon fighter was otherwise engaged. None could break away to help. Why? Lolos wondered, baffled. He was bigger, stronger, faster, his movements sharper and more fluid, yet he still couldn't land a solid hit on the human. Time and again the man slipped free and struck back. Beneath the black armor, the organs under the ribs were ruined, the organs at the waist mangled, bionutrients leaking from torn seams. If it kept up, the suit would lose its power source and become nothing but a corpse of machinery, easy prey for anyone with the nerve to take it. A beast with no skill. Urian's voice echoed those words again. What did skill mean, Lolos thought? Was it really so important? Anger flared in his yellow eyes, and then an idea came. He didn't need skill to beat the human's fancy maneuvers. He could crush him with raw power. Lolos charged. His two bionic arms shot forward, the bone blades on each crossing like pincer jaws aimed at the black-armored warrior. The Randon warleader's guard split wide, exactly the opening Lolos wanted. He crowed, braced his shield, and surged in to repeat the move that had worked for him before. The shield took one blade, the longsword deflected the other. But the expected test of brute force, the lock, the struggle, never came. Deep inside, Urian felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Something was wrong. He tried to pull back, to shift, but it was already too late. Lolos didn't stop. He strode forward with arms outstretched, wrapping Urian in a crushing embrace. Now you have nowhere to run, the Xeno warleader snarled, intent on squeezing the life from him. Urian had no room to maneuver. In a single desperate decision, he drove his longsword at Lolos's control cavity, the living nexus that served as the warleader's command module. Their armors met, living bio-armor pressed against Urian's ceramite plating. From behind, Lolos's tentacles lashed out, each tipped with monomolecular blades, slashing directly at the Grandmaster. Pain exploded as those razor-thin edges nicked through ceramite. Urian jerked his head to evade the worst of it, but it was too late. One blade pierced his second heart, Another shredded his liver, and several tendrils impaled him across the back. Blood seared hot in his mouth as agony overwhelmed him. Author's note, sorry I'm late. Another chapter will follow later. Urian felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. Instinctively, every emergency system in his body kicked in. His Laraman organ activated, Laraman cells flooding out to staunch the bleeding. His heart hammered, driving blood to his brain so he could think. The combat stimulants in his power armor injected themselves, jolting his ravaged body back toward peak performance. The shouts of Legion warriors cut through the haze. Urian's mind cleared. He tightened his grasp on the sword hilt as it threatened to slip and drove the blade forward with everything he had left. There's no way I'm dying with you. Blood spattered from his breathing grill as his power sword bit into Lolos's bio-armor. The disintegration field did its work mercilessly, shredding internal systems and advancing through to the man inside. The blade tore through the diaphragm, protected by the cockpit's layered defenses. Lolos had been savoring what he was sure was victory, until alarms began to scream in his suit and a sudden glint of a blade appeared in the cockpit. No, Lolos shrieked, a raw, unwilling cry as it clawed at the controls with its bionic arms, trying to wrench the human from its hold. The blade didn't pull back. If anything, it moved deeper. Arcs of disintegrating lightning danced along the edge, evaporating the slick bionutrient fluid that had pooled around the wound. Outside the cockpit, Urian drove the sword home. One hand jammed the power sword through the armor, while the other found a protrusion on the bioshell and braced, forcing the blade in farther. Two of the creature's bionic arms wrapped around his waist, and the power sword screamed a high, straining alarm as its systems resisted, but the warning did nothing to change his resolve. Go away. Go away. Lolos whimpered, its voice frayed with panic. A quick decapitation might have spared it terror. Slow death did not. It felt the corrosive lightning gnawing at its flesh, unraveling its form bit by bit. The Xenos war leader recoiled, pressing itself against the cockpit rim, tentacles scrabbling at the edge as it fought to pull free. The longsword kept coming, shearing through the dark green, brain-like mass beneath the wrinkled skin, and the green tissue steamed and dissolved beneath the blade. Blood gushed from Urian's mouth. Pain exploded through his midsection as if his waist were being crushed. His vision tunneled to black. Warning alarms screamed in his head. The Susan membrane was kicking in. The failsafe would force him into stasis any second. Die, he croaked, his voice hollow with blood. With the last of his strength, he drove the longsword into the cockpit of Lolos's bioarmor. The machine shuddered once and went still. A ragged, relieved laugh escaped him. His muscles unclenched, and Urian slid out of the dead armor's grasp, collapsing into the arms of a nearby Legion warrior. Everything had happened so fast. Legion guards surged forward, scooped him up, and carried him to the rear for emergency treatment. Word spread instantly. The Randon war leader was dead. Morale among the Randon collapsed. The Xenos broke and were quickly overwhelmed by the Neuroauxiliary army. The enraged soldiers of the First Legion dragged away Lolos's remains, planning to keep the corpse as a specimen. On a nearby ridge, the mortal auxiliary army roared their triumph, victory, and drove their banners into the heaped bodies of the Randon, declaring the ground war over. Victory! The cry thundered over the comms, a sound like a mountain collapsing and a tsunami rolling through the fleet. Tears of joy streaked down the faces of the auxiliary army. They could finally taste it. Victory at last. The ground campaign had ended, and the space fighting was drawing to a close. The battle moon lay in ruins. With it destroyed, the Randon had lost their interstellar anchor and whatever cohesion remained in their fleet. Morale crumbled. The Randon tried to fall back, but the human fleet struck hard, cutting off every route of escape and forcing a final, brutal engagement. Wreckage drifted through, the star-speckled void. By the time the humans finished their counterattack, only a handful of Randon ships remained. At the system's edge, warp lights flared as a few exhausted stragglers limped away from the Morse star system. Russ and his Wolf Guard boarded the Randon flagship in the chaos, and he took the war leader's life with his own hands, claiming that hard-won glory. But it was a bitter triumph. Humanity had paid dearly to win Morse. The fleet had been bled dry. Doom stepped down from the command throne and let out a long, weary sigh. 30% of the fleet's warships were gone, and not a single surviving ship sailed unscathed. Repairs would take time, and the cost of victory would linger long after the cheers faded. The First Legion fleet had paid a terrible price. Over half its strength was gone. If not for the 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the losses would have been even worse. The Abomination Exemplar lay crippled, 40% of her hull breached, and listing. She was on the brink of sinking. The Space Wolves fleet had lost 2/5 of its ships. Still, the Wolves had fought with savage courage, charging into enemy formations, refusing to break, and holding the Randon warships long enough for others to withdraw. When the smoke cleared, humanity had lost more than 200 capital ships, but they had destroyed nearly 500 Randon capital vessels and 3 battle moons. The greatest prize, grimly, was tens of thousands of captured Randon elite warriors. It was a costly victory, but a victory nonetheless, the first real blunt answer humanity had given the Randon. Doom stood at the Royal Majesty's viewport, watching wreckage drift past. Twisted metal, frozen human corpses, and the grotesque remains of Randon's slave soldiers. He stared into the black beyond, the turmoil in his chest slowly easing. The war with the Randon was on hold for now. Both sides would need to lick their wounds and prepare for the inevitable, more terrible clash to come. Notify Terra to send construction crews, turn Morse into a fortified system. Doom intended to make Morse a bridgehead, the first line of defense against the Randon. Their appearance at Morse was no accident. They meant to use it as a springboard toward the Imperium. The next engagement would likely erupt in this sector. Preparing now would prevent the conflict from flaring up again. He didn't hesitate. Even in the uneasy calm after the battle, Doom moved to lock down the region. Use my authority to order the 5th Legion to dispatch additional scout flotillas to locate the Randon Empire's territory and homeworld, he said. Put all legions on high alert. The Randon are now our top priority. If Morse shows any further activity, nearby legions must provide immediate support. The military conscription authority granted by the Emperor authorized Doom to act swiftly in situations like this. Notify the Noor worlds to guard against Randon infiltration. They don't know about us yet and will try to pick up intelligence. Sophia, at his shoulder, recorded each instruction and had the Astropath choir transmit them one by one. Oh, right, Doom turned to Sophia. How are the banquets coming along? He had not forgotten his promise to Russ, to host a feast for the Space Wolves as thanks for their aid. He had coaxed his brother into the fiercest battles with the prospect of reward. This small duty must not fail him. Preparations have begun, Sophia replied carefully. The garden deck is being cleaned of the last traces of war. It will be ready soon. Very good, thank you, Doom smiled. If not for Sophia, his chief steward, he would have been arranging every detail himself. Serving you is my vow, she said. With a graceful lift of her skirts and a low curtsy, she excused herself and slipped away. All across the system, the fleet was gathering what remained of its forces, ships falling into assigned positions to take stock and consolidate losses. After a battle of that scale, the toll was heavy. For someone in Doom's position, it might be reduced to new embers on a report, but the mood through the human fleet was somber. Countless shipboard thralls had perished. A single breached airlock on a warship could mean the sacrifice of many mortals. The fleet detached a number of specialized vessels to recover the dead. The crews who had fallen were given rights befitting warriors. Their remains were consigned to the nearest sun so that they might sleep in the light. The Xenos received no such honor. Their bodies were fed to plasma incinerators until nothing of them remained. In the end, ash was ash, but the meaning behind each fate stood worlds apart. Some were to be hated, others to be remembered. Several Terran days later, a mountain of data sat ready before Doom. Columns and tables, casualty lists, and roll calls of heroism, reports of actions that demanded decoration, so much that Doom's fingers ached from scrolling. He looked up, ran a hand over his temples, and gave a terse order. Send fast ships back to Terra. Bring medals with them when they return. The files were too complex to be entrusted to the astropaths. Not only was the volume immense, but the kind of precise numerical detail compiled, minute casualty figures, award citations tied to timestamps and coordinates, was the sort of cold ledger an astropath could not reliably translate. Doom verified the folders one last time, sealed the transmission, and released it toward Homeworld. A hologram flickered to life in the command chamber. Russ filled the projection with that wolfish, weathered face, but it was touched by weariness. Even his trademark ferocity could not hide the lines of fatigue. "My brother," he said, voice hoarse, "is your banquet ready?" The Space Wolves had taken heavy losses. Russ kept his sorrow bunched down under a mask of savage cheer. It was how he honored the dead without breaking. Doom returned the look, grave and steady. "It is ready," he said. He inclined his head and let the silence that followed carry what words could not. Doom felt grateful for Russ's magnanimity, for fighting with everything he had during the operation, for taking the Legion's losses in silence after the war, and for bearing the grief of his son's sacrifices. It was time for a proper drink, to wash away the sorrow and lift their spirits. Doom looked at Russ, his eyes said it all. "Once the fleet has finished its business, I'll drink with you until we're done." The men of Fenris await Nor's hospitality. Russ grinned broadly, a look that made Doom wonder whether his brother was genuinely simple-minded or only pretending. "We won't disappoint you. Thanks to Bao JJ for the reward." Chapter 214, Discipline. Urian woke to find his wounds already healed. He pulled on his robe and left at once, taking a shuttle from the indomitable truth to the royal majesty. The war was over, but his guilt had not been judged. He had invented an excuse to move troops without authorization and led the Legion into an Xenos ambush. If the Primarch's intervention had not come when it did, the First Legion might have been shattered. On the brightly lit bridge, Doom had sent everyone else away. The Primarch stood alone, a figure of cold authority, his attention fixed on the Grand Master. Urian's muscular form was swathed in coarse linen, his head stayed bowed, his face hidden by the lowered chin. In Doom's left hand was a scroll of confession, Urian's own words, taking full blame for what had happened. Urian Bendigard. Doom spoke the name slowly, deeply. "Was it all your doing alone?" Doom's eyes narrowed like blades, cutting through Urian's defenses, probing down to bone and marrow. Urian felt exposed. Beneath that stare there was nowhere to hide, no secret that could survive. Despite everything, the man responsible for the First Legion straightened his neck and in a low voice said, "It was all my doing alone." As he spoke, his body tightened, his fists curled briefly, an attempt to hide a tremor at his heart. Urian, Grandmaster by posture, practiced in concealment, was lying to the Primarch, but the effort was clumsy and transparent. From the throne came a short, cold laugh, utterly devoid of warmth. The Primarch's amusement was unmistakable. At that sound, Urian's head bowed a little lower. His broad shoulders drew in, his body rigid with effort. He dared not let any other expression show. He knew his claim was childish and obvious, seen through from the moment the words left his mouth. Still he had spoken it, not to fool the Primarch, but to signal something else, that the Grand Master of the First Legion was prepared to take the blame alone. Doom felt no anger at the deliberate concealment. From his throne he only asked, who masterminded the unauthorized deployment of the Legion's ships? "It was I." Urian's answer came fast, without hesitation. "To seize temporary command of the army, I ordered the Legion's battleships to spoof Xandan transponders and violate the Shana system." Doom inclined his head. He watched the Grand Master closely, the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his breath, and found no sign of deceit. It appeared the plot to wrest control had indeed been led by the Grand Master himself. After a long, contemplative pause, the Primarch spoke softly. "Then I shall consider it your doing alone." Urian's head dropped a little lower. A tight breath of relief escaped him, and his tone softened by several degrees. "Thank you for your mercy, great scion of the Emperor, Primarch," he murmured. Those 3 words from the Primarch meant he would probe no further. All blame and punishment would fall solely on Urian. The First Legion's honor would remain intact. It would not be tarnished by disgrace for this transgression. "No, you misunderstand," Doom said, and the words plunged Urian into an icy abyss, every scrap of relief he had felt evaporating. "You will be punished. You are relieved of your duties as Grand Master. Choose a suitable successor. Then take up a solitary watch in the Morse star system, vigilant against any further Xandan incursions. Your life will be spared, so that you may reflect on your failures and atone for the warriors who fell, who gave their lives because of your personal choices. The Primarch's decree was not issued in a formal court, but his authority eclipsed any tribunal. Urien had no quarrel with the sentence. If anything, he felt a strange gratitude. Execution would have been simple, final. Instead, his life was spared, so he could live out his penance and perhaps still be of use. "Thank you for your mercy," he said, voice thick with acceptance. He bowed to the punishment entirely. He would take up the guard in the Morse system and wear his guilt as duty. Doom's tone shifted when he began, regarding the First Legion. And then the Primarch's voice faltered, leaving the thought unfinished. Although he had the legal authority to mete out punishment to the First Legion, Urien was not their gene-father. The Primarch's judgment carried the greater weight. The Primarch's hesitation made Urien's hands tremble. The fate of the Legion mattered far more than his own safety. The Grand Master would have died 10,000 deaths to secure a lighter sentence for them. After a long, cold pause, Doom spoke and announced the punishment for the First Legion. The First Legion will proceed to Shana and dock at the Forge World for 2 years. During that time, you will not take part in the Great Crusade. 2 years will give you the time you need to repair your vessels and to rest and reflect on whether the Legion's course has strayed. The First Legion was once the most glorious of all. You know better than I what it has become. Your excessive hunger for glory has led you away from the true path. To the wider Imperium, I will proclaim that the First Legion is recuperating from its battle wounds. Urien felt the pressure lift in a single, fragile breath. The sentence was punishment, but it was not annihilation. A merciful exile where the Legion could mend both hull and honor. The sentence is a suspension, a period for you to reflect on your mistakes, Doom said. Having pronounced the punishment for the First Legion, he turned to the Grand Master. Urien Bendigard, do you have any objections? Absolutely none. Urien dropped to one knee, bowing his head low. Once again, thank you for your mercy, for allowing the First Legion to preserve its honor. His gratitude was genuine, the great weight pressing on him at last eased. The Primarch's ruling struck a careful balance. It punished the Legion, but did not disgrace it. 2 years away from the Great Crusade would coincide with the time needed to repair their warships, and it would give the Legion a chance to rest. Even before Urien assumed command as Grand Master, he had been painfully aware of the Legion's problems. It was time to pull back, let the warriors reconsider their choices, and break the spiraling cycle of error. You may go now. Let the First Legion reflect properly, Doom said, waving him away. Urien rose, bowed once more, and began to withdraw, each step slower than the last, as relief and responsibility warred within him. You're still too merciful. After Urien left, the concealed door behind the throne swung open, and Russ stepped out slowly. If they dared to pull a stunt like that on me, every senior officer of the First Legion would have been marched out into the Fenrisian ice wastes to feed the wolves. He spoke the words with mock menace, but his tone and bearing were deferential. He had come aboard the Royal Majesty earlier, Russ explained, only he had stayed hidden in the secret chamber rather than risk embarrassing the Grand Master. Doom merely shook his head. Urien will live the rest of his days burdened by his brother's deaths, he said quietly. The First Legion will be chastened too, its lust for glory curbed so it can learn from this. Come, Doom added, rising and gesturing toward the garden deck. Let us sample the fine wines of Nur. Russ seized Doom's arm and pulled him off the bridge with familiar intimacy. Finally, he said, grinning. I couldn't wait. They walked shoulder to shoulder down the bright, austere corridor and took the lift up to the garden deck. Your flagship truly is finer than mine, Russ murmured as they went, his golden, bestial eyes roaming over the Royal Majesty's decorations with obvious appreciation. The Glory Queen-class battleship had been reborn. Its corridors were unusually wide and bathed in a gentle, constant light. Intricate high-tech devices lined the walls, and different kinds of robots moved quietly along the decks, keeping the ship running smoothly. Compared with that, the Imperial warships felt almost lifeless. A maze of exposed steel and piping, with gaunt, cramped passageways. Doom waved a hand and shook his head. He spoke modestly, as if apologizing for the difference in taste. It's just a matter of style. The Hrafunkel has a very Fenrisian aesthetic. Russ smiled. There are loyalties that don't mind appearances. A child does not despise its mother's ugliness, nor a dog its poor home, he thought, and Fenris was both his home and his pride. Doom's face grew serious. If you want artillery upgrades, he said, you should send the fleet to Nur. He meant it. Doom was still grateful for Russ's help and wanted to return the favor. At the mention of Nur, Russ's golden bestial eyes lit up. He had long coveted Nur's shipboard weapon systems. Their range was unmatched, and their destructive power outclassed equivalent Imperial armaments. If those weapons were fitted to the Space Wolves' fleet, its firepower would more than double. That kind of increase in combat power would be a massive boon to the Crusade. Indeed, Doom said, not stingy with his approval. Russ broke into a wide grin and slapped Doom's broad back with one hand, repeating, "Good, good, good." "The fleet's badly mauled," Russ continued. "We won't limp to a Forge world for patchwork repairs. We'll make for the Nor worlds. They can repair us and upgrade our guns at the same time." "Once this is settled, we'll go with you," Doom agreed. The First Fleet had taken heavy losses and needed to return to port for proper repairs and resupply. Russ, elated, threw an arm around Doom's shoulder, a fanged smile splitting his face. Their intervention had cost them dearly, but the gains were enormous. The Xenos fleet had been annihilated, the chapter's honor had grown, and now they could lift the fleet's fighting power to a new level. In hindsight, the sacrifice of his sons had been worth it. With Nor weapons improved, more of his wolf cubs would live to fight another day. 215. Visitors. The two Primarchs stepped onto the garden deck, and with their arrival the banquet formally began. The deck itself was a marvel, 20 kilometers long, 5 kilometers wide, and 100 meters high, the grandest space on the battleship. A holographic sky arched overhead in perfect, endless blue. The artificial sunlight was soft and warm, convincing enough to feel like the real thing. Below, the garden had been arranged for a feast. 10,000 gilded dining tables glittered across the lawn like a field of stars, each set with delicate porcelain plates. From the transparent elevator, Doom took in the scene and nodded in approval. Sophia had organized everything with obvious care. 1,000 custodians, who were rarely seen out of their battle armor, had set aside their blades for golden silk robes. They lounged with an easy, almost insolent composure. Their seats were reserved in a section at the heart of the garden, a deliberate placement to underline their exceptional status. The destroyer warriors were seated beside them. The pairing looked natural and fitting, not at all out of place. Their genetic augmentation had been overseen by the custodians, and because the two groups shared deep ties with them, the seating was as practical as it was symbolic. The Night Watch sat beside the destroyer warriors. Both were warriors of Doom, so their proximity felt natural. Nearby were senior representatives of the Space Wolves and the First Legion, with fine wine and fresh fruit laid out before them. A contingent of the Adeptus Mechanicus was also present. Several Mechanicus sages hovered at the edge of the gathering, whispering as they inspected the garden's design. At the center of the inner ring stood a massive table flanked by 2 enormous chairs. 20 high-backed seats ran down its sides, occupied by the true high-ranking officials. Water flowed through the garden, a faint floral scent hung on the air, and fountains rose and fell to the accompaniment of soft music. The setting was almost languid, but the mood was anything but relaxed. The First Legion Space Marines sat bolt upright, their black armor polished to a mirror sheen, every man alert and immaculately composed. Even the boisterous wolves fell silent. A hush spread through the garden as the transparent elevator descended, carrying the two Primarchs into view. All eyes tracked them. At their arrival, a ripple went through the assembled ranks, and with a single rustle, everyone rose. 100,000 Space Marines stood to their feet, the clatter of plate and greaves striking in perfect, disciplined time. No warrior wanted to be the one to lose face before his kin. The two Primarchs towered before the round table, their silhouettes filling the light. Doom's voice rolled out through the hall's audio mesh, low and authoritative. As host, he owed the courtesy of a declaration. It framed the purpose of the feast for every officer and veteran present. "The campaign on Randon has reached a decisive phase," he intoned. We gather to celebrate its hard-won victories. Attendants bowed and offered goblets. Doom and Russ inclined to accept, palms closing around the cool stems. Within each glass, the wine ran deep and red. They lifted them together. "Let us toast to victory," Doom said. Russ bared his fangs, lifted his goblet, and threw his head back as he bellowed to the sky. "Victory! Victory!" The cry swept the banquet like wildfire. 100,000 voices answered the Primarchs, so fierce and united that the wine in the goblets trembled against their rims. "For this victory we have paid too high a price." Doom's voice was quiet, almost reverent, as he set his wineglass on the table and lifted it slightly. "To those who sacrificed." He and Russ poured a little wine onto the floor as a libation, then raised their glasses and drank the first sip in memory of the fallen. "To the sacrificed," a low, heavy chant rose around the hall, and more than one eye glistened with unshed tears. "Please be seated." Doom raised a hand to indicate Russ would take the first place. As host of the banquet, he was obliged to show courtesy and seat his honored guest. Russ waved off the formality with a single easy gesture, crossed to the large round table, and took the chair to the right. There was a soft rustle as the rest of the guests followed suit and settled into their places. Music resumed. From all sides, attendants in white silk appeared, arranging themselves in neat pairs before each table. They moved with light feet and practiced grace, standing ready to serve the victorious army with courtly attentiveness. Robot dining carts rolled in, depositing an array of steaming dishes, while attendants set them carefully on the table. Russ couldn't help but nod in approval. "This is really something. I'm actually looking forward to the trip to Nur," he said. The formal, grand etiquette suited the occasion perfectly. Doom returned the smile. "It will suit you," he said, pride coloring his voice. He straightened slightly. Nur's meticulous court rituals were an unbroken tradition stretching back millennia, and he felt that weight with every practiced gesture. Russ, guided by a keen nose, kept twitching his nostrils as each new aroma reached him. "These smell amazing," he murmured. Doom chuckled and explained, "Those are meat beasts from our agricultural worlds, carefully raised, humanely slaughtered on a strict schedule, then frozen in stasis field warehouses to lock in the peak flavor." Every dish the attendants served was a top-tier product from Nur's farms, reserved for the most distinguished guests. For this banquet, Doom had even assigned an entire ship to transport the food and hospitality supplies, ensuring nothing arrived anything less than perfect. "That's over the top. It must take a lot of resources, right?" Russ licked his lips, admiring the spread and noting how much care his brother had put into the banquet. Doom shook his head. "This is just ordinary provision. The Nor worlds are wealthy now. In food, clothing, and daily necessities, there's barely any difference between nobility and commoners." Russ's eyes widened. "Ordinary provision?" "Yes," Doom nodded. "People of Nor who contribute enough are entitled to these material guarantees." Russ clicked his tongue in disbelief. He hadn't expected ordinary people to enjoy such comforts. Deeply moved, he found himself more and more eager to see, with his own eyes, the Nor worlds under his brother's rule. "Heh!" Russ cleared his throat and addressed the attendant at his side. "Madam, tell the kitchens to bring out a great deal of wine and meat. Plenty of good wine, plenty of good meat, especially for those men." He nodded toward the space wolves. Knowing his brother's coffers were overflowing, Russ had no qualms about indulging. He planned to eat back every ounce of energy he'd spent in battle. "As you command, my lord," the attendant replied in a soft, pleasant voice, bowing gracefully before she left. Russ turned to his brother with mock solemnity. "You don't mind, do you? Don't be offended." Doom waved him off with a generous sweep of his hand. "Don't worry about it. Eat your fill." Russ's grin widened. He rose from his chair, pointed at the space wolves, and called out, "Space wolves!" A wild howl rose up in answer to their gene father, and the pack roared back, "We will eat our fill! Drink your fill!" The wolf lord's wild roar lit up the hall. "There's plenty of wine and meat here." "To the Primarch," the space wolves called, raising their cups toward Doom in sincere salute. To the space wolves. Doom poured himself a generous glass of the wine, lifted it in return, and downed it in a single swallow. The tension in the room thawed at once. Laughter and clatter replaced the earlier formality, and the feast was officially underway. This is bliss, Russ said, closing his eyes as he swallowed, the corners of his mouth lifting. He narrowed his eyes appreciatively and set the glass down. I've been looking forward to this sip for a long time. Oh, Doom glanced at him, curious. Have you had it afore, my lord? Sophia appeared at just the right moment, bending close to Doom's ear. In the Gateway star system, Nur's vintages are famous. Rogue traders fight over shipments of it. Doom's eyes softened as he put the pieces together. So that was it. Russ must have acquired this wine through a rogue trader. Those unscrupulous merchants. Russ ground his teeth and muttered the words under his breath. They actually tried to trade a transport ship for a single crate of wine. The price made Doom's stomach drop. He turned to Sophia, voice tight with disbelief. Are our goods really worth that much? Not yours. Before Sophia could answer, Russ cut in. It's the rogue traders. They buy up stock and resell it at thousands of times the price. You can't stop that. Doom shook his head, helpless. Merchants chased profit. Hoarding and speculation were nothing new. Then he looked back at Russ, his eyes narrowing. You didn't actually trade for it, did you? Russ took another long swallow and drained his cup. Doom watched him with a flicker of suspicion. One crate of wine for a transport ship made no sense. Russ couldn't possibly have made a deal like that, and yet here he was, drinking the wine. How had he gotten it? Heh, Russ grinned, fingers running under the thick mane at Doom's jaw. The galaxy's a dangerous place. Pirates everywhere. You really are. Doom trailed off, surprised by his brother's boldness. So you robbed them. I didn't. Russ protested, shaking his head with a rakish smile. Don't be ridiculous. Don't slander your brother. Drink, drink. Changing the subject, Russ pushed a glass toward Doom. Today we drink until we can't stand. They clinked their glasses. Far away, a vast fleet tore through the warp toward the Morse star system. A Gloriana-class battleship led the formation, the ancient Roman numeral Tixth carved into its flank like a challenge. Gene Father, the Morse system ahead, a warrior of the 2nd Legion, reported to the tall figure standing at the viewport. The man said nothing. The mottled colors of the warp shimmered across his eyes. He simply nodded. The warrior, almost in passing and with a tired sigh, muttered, Got home at 8, completely wiped out. 216. Weird brothers. The tall figure said nothing, but his jet-black eyes seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken things. He stared into the warp, his thoughts drifting somewhere unreachable. My lord, should we inform our allies of our arrival? The Legion commander asked, hesitating. He dared not presume the Gene Father's mind. No need. They already know, the tall figure finally replied, his voice slow and heavy. As the giant had predicted, Doom and Russ were already aware that a fleet was approaching through the warp. Francisca's soft voice then answered from the stasis chamber where she rarely left. Ever vigilant, the navigator monitored the warp's movements. My lords, a fleet is approaching in the warp, she reported. Doom's large hand paused midair with a wineglass between his fingers. He didn't clink glasses with Russ. The Primarch's golden brows knit in thought, wondering who would arrive at such a moment. Around the table, the representatives fell silent, hands still, waiting for their Primarchs to decide. Doom waved a dismissive hand. Russ gave a curt nod. The signal was clear. There was no need for alarm. The banquet resumed. They didn't think it could be the Randan. There was no way he could have returned so soon. The only reasonable explanation was that the ships on approach were friendly. Sophia's projection drifted closer, bringing up a hollow of the lead warship. Imperial, she said, voice steady, 2nd Legion markings. At that, Russ's brow eased. He tipped his cup back and swallowed before answering. A rare guest, he said. Doom, still drinking, noticed something off in his brother's tone. Too flat, too distant. He set his cup down. Do you know him? Not really, Russ shrugged. I've never met the man. Only rumors. Horus fought beside him and had nothing but praise. Said our unknown brother had the makings of a war leader. Isn't that high praise? Doom asked, puzzled by Russ's cool reaction to a fellow 2nd Legion veteran. His behavior's odd, Russ said, setting his wineglass down and topping it off as he spoke. I always get the feeling he doesn't really fit in with us. Since he came back, he barely speaks to outsiders, Doom agreed. He's indifferent to everything around him. Humph. Russ snorted and glanced over at Doom with irritation. Once I was on Terra for business, and he happened to be there too. I invited him to stop by, and he refused. Doom's thick eyebrows knitted together. Refusing a visit from a blood brother without any explanation was a bit much. He didn't think there'd been anything improper about Russ's invitation. Their brother's gruffness was mostly surface. Beneath it, Doom had always suspected, his heart was warm and surprisingly delicate, more genuine than the airs of those polished nobles. Russ jabbed a finger at his own nose and scoffed. Maybe he was afraid I'd notice his weird smell. Doom chuckled and shook his head helplessly. Russ clearly had a lot of theories about that brother. That man is very strange, Russ said, unfazed, and went on cataloging the oddities. Before and after his return, the Second Legion's organization and tactics haven't changed at all. The colors haven't changed, neither has the Legion's emblem. He hasn't even given his sons a proper name. It's as if he has nothing to do with the Imperium. He's cut himself off. The more Doom listened, the grimmer his face became. He set his wineglass down and felt the weight of what Russ was saying. His brother, one he had never met, was behaving in ways that didn't add up. Not changing the Legion's paint scheme could be pardoned as indifference or simple neglect. Sticking with the old emblem might mean he hasn't yet found one he likes. But not naming the Legion at all was astonishing. A Primarch is the father of his Legion. Naming it is not a trivial courtesy, it is a duty, like a mortal father naming his child. The Legion's name is one of its greatest honors, a badge of identity that binds its warriors together and gives them a sense of belonging. To leave it unnamed was almost unthinkable. A father who refused to name his own son, that was too bizarre to accept. Russ watched his brother brooding for a moment, then shove a mouthful of meat into his mouth. His expression hardened with contempt. He probably doesn't even acknowledge the Imperium, he said between chews. Thinks himself too clean to take part in our dirty work. How did the Emperor find him? Doom asked quietly. Everything pointed to the boy's origin as the real problem. Russ had already looked into it. A ship, he replied at once, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. A ship, Doom echoed. Russ nodded emphatically. Yes, a ship. Father killed the crew and brought him back to the Imperium. Doom leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper meant only for Russ. Xenos? He didn't really need to ask. In his mind, the answer was already settled. Only Xenos could have driven the Emperor to slaughter an entire ship's company. If it had been an artificial intelligence, the Emperor would have examined it, handed the matter to Nur, and taken whatever advantage could be had at his leisure. Russ leaned in toward Doom, their voices dropping to a hush. He was with Xenos, Russ said, out wandering the void with them. Aimlessly? Russ snorted. You expect me to believe that? Doom only shook his head slowly. He couldn't accept the idea that a Primarch would simply drift without purpose. It's more likely he was traveling with them when the Emperor happened upon them and cut whatever plan he had short, he mused. Perhaps he kept silent to protect the Xenos. Russ lowered his voice, incredulous. Even if our upbringings were different, Father put hatred of Xenos into our blood. Why would he abandon that, lose his dignity like that? Doom said nothing, only continuing to shake his head. He hadn't met the brother himself and had no right to pass judgment based on someone else's impressions. Later, be discreet and don't reveal too much about the Legion, Doom said, his brow furrowed. I don't think this is as simple as it seems. You know I'm a barbarian, Russ replied with a knowing smile, leaning in. What have you seen? Nothing, Doom answered slowly. Only that our brother is wrapped in a shadow I cannot fathom. Until we understand it, it's best to keep our counsel. Russ listened and fell silent, nodding in agreement. Doom paused a few seconds, then called out, Sophia, send Urian to me. He gave Russ a look that asked him to cover. Russ understood. He lifted his wine goblet, rose, and drew every eye in the hall. Let us toast to victory, he cried, draining the cup with a bright, exhilarated expression. The Space Marines rose and raised their own glasses to honor the Primarch. They were puzzled by the sudden movement, but assumed the Wolf King simply felt merry from the wine. That the other Primarch had slipped away at that moment was not something they noticed, or felt it was their concern. Doom moved the instant Russ stood, so fast that the Space Marines hardly had time to register it. He was gone in a blink, slipping into the hidden chamber where the others waited. Once inside, he wasted no time. Open a route to the garden, he he ordered. Make sure it won't expose any of our sensitive information, and quietly warn our people to be more cautious. No loose talk. Sophia nodded and recorded every instruction as Doom spoke. At her command, the data center began pushing out the necessary directives. Encrypted channels opened, access logs were masked, and contingency protocols activated. Back in the banquet hall, the clink of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation hid the undercurrent of activity. Destroyer warriors who had received psychic prompts passed along coded messages to the Night Watch, folding the instructions into routine exchanges. To anyone eavesdropping, the phrases were nothing more than casual asides. To those in the know, they were clear, precise orders. A short while later, the Grand Master excused himself from the table and made his way to the secret room. He stepped in without understanding why he had been summoned. Only the Primarch and a few close aides knew the full reason for the sudden, careful maneuvering. Doom regarded Urian, who still hadn't stepped down, and asked with a grave expression, "Grandmaster, do you trust me?" The weight of the question seemed to buckle Urian's knees. He dropped to one knee and answered, "I trust you completely." Doom crouched, hauled him up, and gave a small reassuring motion. "If you trust me, then when you're in front of the 2nd Legion Primarch, reveal as little specific information about your legion as possible." Urian opened his mouth, brimming with questions, but the Primarch cut him off. "There is no why, only trust," Doom said without further explanation, looking down at the Grand Master. "How you interpret that is for you to decide. I will not force you." Urian wiped cold sweat from his brow and nodded, a new unease settling over him as he realized how deeply the 1st Legion was being pulled into something dangerous and uncertain. Doom gave a final nod, said nothing more, turned, and left the private chamber, rejoining the others in the main hall. Chapter 2 of 14, Moribus Saurus. The Primarch's return drew attention like a magnet. Odysseus's brow tightened, the handsome features of his face turned grave as he fixed a troubled look on the Primarch and the Grand Master who walked behind him. Emerald eyes full of thought, he shifted slightly and inclined his head, whispering something inaudible to a fellow custodian. The mood in the custodes area changed subtly. Conversations dimmed and took on a new, cautious edge. Urian went back to the Legion's seating, and while talking with the senior officers, slipped information to them in the Legion's secret tongue. Doom resumed his place. Russ was quick to press a drink into his hands and urged him to keep drinking. "I don't know if this is right," Doom murmured, hesitation undercutting his words. His brother's origins and motives were unclear. It might be sensible to proceed more cautiously. But to involve the 1st Legion in all of this was taking it too far. If his brother ever found out, he would almost certainly bear a grudge. Doom would later feel a pang of guilt for the extra vigilance and worry he'd shown. "We're both guilty of it," Russ said, throwing an arm over Doom's shoulder with an easy, indifferent grin. "There's something not right about him." Doom answered quietly, "A man who sets himself apart either bends over backwards to please everyone or shuts himself off from them all." Russ shrugged. "He can distance himself from both his Legion and the Imperium if he wishes. We aren't unreasonable to be wary." Doom sighed. With 20 Primarch brothers, it was impossible to be close to them all. Human beings naturally form cliques, and even the Primarchs could not escape that tendency. Only a handful had returned so far. As more came back, relationships would inevitably grow tangled and difficult to unravel. For now, all Doom could do was keep up the outward trappings of brotherhood. He raised his goblet and clinked it against Russ's. The banquet went on, waiting for the brothers still to come back from the warp. The banquet aboard the Royal Majesty ran long. As the wine and talk loosened tongues, the Legion warriors began to move more freely among one another, strengthening old bonds and forging new ones among kin. Midway through the revelry, a pale light bloomed at the porthole. The fleet was dropping out of the warp. Heads turned. From the pennants and hull markings, everyone quickly knew which force it was. The 2nd Legion had arrived. Excitement rippled through the crowd. A Gloriana-class battleship meant a Primarch was coming to join them. "Come on," Doom said, hauling Russ to his feet from the blanket on the deck. The Wolf King had been drunk for some time. "Let's go greet our brother." Russ opened his golden eyes, seized Doom's arm, and hauled himself up. A white mist rose from his skin, as if some inner flame expelled the wine. The drink left him at once, and his mind snapped clear. He gave a great, rumbling yawn, the scent of ale on his breath. "He's rather late," he said. Doom nodded and gestured to a nearby maid holding folded clothes. Russ's arms were coated in grime. The maid stepped forward to hand him a clean tunic. Russ crouched, took the garments from the maid's hands, and flashed an easy grin. "Lady, you'd best step back for a moment," he said. Ignoring the maid's embarrassed flushing, he shrugged out of his robe, revealing a powerful, owned physique, and changed in full view of the onlookers. The Norfleet's chronicler brightened instantly and began to sketch, capturing the Primarch's sculpted form with quick, deft strokes. Many of the mortal female officers blushed, covering their mouths to stifle startled gasps. A few stood on tiptoe to get a better view, eyes shining with admiration. His broad, masculine frame sent the women's faces a deep, crimson flush. When he finished dressing, Russ grinned. "This suits me better," he said. Doom offered a wry, accurate verdict, like a beast in scholar's robes. Russ's golden hair caught the light, and his amber eyes had that fierce, wild gleam. The aide had smoothed his mane. He now wore a winter-hued robe patterned with pale blue ice motifs, clothing that seemed spun from snow and frost, lending a touch of elegance to the Wolf King's untamed presence. A little unaccustomed to the voluminous sleeves, Russ spread his arms, turned them a few times, and rolled the fabric up his forearms. "There, nothing awkward about it," he said. "Come, let us go greet our brother," Doom replied, nodding toward Sophia, who held a holographic projection of the boarding request. Russ gave a curt nod, picked 10 Wolf Guard at random, and accompanied Doom. Doom, however, chose 10 Destroyer Warriors instead of sending the Night Watch. He had reasons. The Night Watch had come from the Nor worlds, and by the time their brother's shuttle arrived, they had already departed. The Iron Men who had been invited to the banquet were gone as well, kept out of sight. It was no secret that Nor possessed Iron Men, but the particulars were not widely circulated. There is a world of difference between a general rumor and hard detail. They reached the landing pad just as the 2nd Legion's shuttle settled with flawless timing. The hatch folded open, and a tall figure stepped down. Doom and Russ's eyes brightened. The man who stood before them fully justified the name Primarch. He was as tall as Doom, though a specialized, steel-gray suit of power armor hid most of his frame. His face was thin, black hair falling to his cheeks, a little untidy, giving him a weary, melancholic air. The gaunt features carried a grave, almost regal quality, and his most arresting feature was his silver-gray eyes, which lent him an air of noble mystery. When he stepped out of the cabin, those silver-gray eyes swept the area and naturally found his 2 brothers. Only a Primarch could have a human silhouette so large and imposing. As Doom watched his brother emerge, a faint flash of surprise crossed his face. He had become aware of another presence toward the rear of the Primarch's retinue. Mixed in with the guard, men clad in MK power armor, was a disguised figure. Doom's gaze snapped to that figure, who had positioned himself third from the end of the guard and looked no different from any other legionary. Alfarius, clutching his banner, felt that look pass over him like a physical thing. He turned his head in the smallest motion, trying to catch the man's eyes, but Doom had already averted his gaze. Had he been spotted? Alfarius couldn't be sure. He didn't believe his brother's scrutiny had been accidental. As a professional agent and master infiltrator, Moribas Soros trusted his instincts above all else. His senses were unusually sharp. He didn't believe in coincidences. Moribas Soros. The voice cut through the quiet like a blade. The stern expression on the tall figure who had spoken softened into an easy smile as he greeted his brothers. "Doom Novik," he announced calmly. "Leman Russ." The third name followed, delivered with the same restrained authority. The 3 Primarchs closed the distance between them, faces lighting with the joy of reunion and a hard-won, blood-kin affection. Russ's nose twitched once or twice, as if he'd picked up a scent, but he quickly composed himself. "Brother, come with us. There's a banquet being held here," Doom said, welcoming Soros and steering him toward the garden. They did not embrace. Power armor made such gestures awkward. Instead, Doom and Russ took up positions on either side of Soros, who stood between them in a show of mutual respect. Soros smiled. "It seems you've won a great victory," he said, sincere. Around them, the ruined hulks of warships drifting through the system bore mute witness to how brutal the fighting had been. The banquet being held amid the wreckage was the other proof. Humanity had prevailed. Even an ordinary onlooker would have picked up the signs, let alone a Primarch. "Yes," Doom said, puffing out his chest and announcing with exaggerated bravado, "a glorious great victory." Russ almost laughed. His brother's posture and gestures were perfect, deliberately theatrical. Anyone who didn't know better might take him for a proud braggart. Soros, however, kept his tone flat and said only, "Congratulations," offering a non-committal salute to Doom's claimed success. Inside, he tried to gauge whether his brother was genuinely vain or merely putting on an act. Words could be faked, the reality of the campaign could not. Most of the warships anchored in the Morse star system were badly damaged, and the fleet was far from whole. Any observer with a moment's attention could see how costly and relentless the fighting had been. The victory itself could not reasonably be denied, but it was hardly the triumphant, shining triumph Doom proclaimed. Doom knew that perfectly well. Still, he staged the performance openly. Whether others believed it mattered little. He believed it first. The three Primarchs led the way down the bright corridor toward the garden to join the banquet. At first, Soros studied every difference aboard the warship with careful attention, cataloging details as if mapping a foreign city. After a while, though, his curiosity faded. The corridors were monotonous and bright, repeating like layers of mirrors that stretched on and on. There was a peculiar comfort in the rhythm, however. Whenever his eyes began to grow weary, a sudden corner or a bulkhead would break the pattern and dispel the mounting visual fatigue. He walked with his two blood brothers, the Primarchs, their voices low and easy. They talked about trivial human things, who could outdrink whom, who always ended up belligerent at banquets, their thoughts still half at the tables they'd left behind. When the conversation touched on the campaign, the reports were frustratingly vague. Two versions of the same incident, each colored by its teller, so that truth and rumor blurred together. Soros glanced at them and let a small smile cross his face. "How interesting," he said, but the smile did little to mask the deep sigh beneath it, burning into Surira's. Soros felt a hard, familiar wariness, the peculiar estrangement that had settled between him and his blood brothers. There was no subtlety to it. They kept him at arm's length. He neither lashed out nor wept. Exclusion was a consequence he had invited. That knowledge steadied him more than it stung. The three Primarchs strode into the garden banquet, and everyone present, except the custodes and the destroyers, fell to their knees. To behold the glory of the Emperor's sons and to taste wine at their table was a moment every warrior treasured. For a moment, the courtyard hummed with the low, reverent murmur of admiration. A voice cut through the hush. "Rise." Doom's command rolled across the hall and the ranks straightened. A massive chair had been added to the main table, set beside the others to mark the Primarch's place. Doom took the center, Soros and Russ seated to his right and left, their positions allowing them to see the assembled faces. Doom lifted an ornate bottle and with deliberate care poured for each of his brothers. "Brothers," he said, offering the cup, "please taste the fine wine from my homeland." The wine came from Nur, brewed to a Golden Age recipe and blended for the fastidious palates of the Golden Men. Its color was the vivid, pigeon blood red of a prized ruby. Its flavor was mellow and sweet, lingering on the tongue and leaving an endless aftertaste. Of all the fine vintages Doom had ever sampled, only two could consistently outdo it: the Necron reserves of Trazyn the Undying and the secret vintage crafted by the Old Ones. The former needed no explanation. The tastes favored by the royal houses of an ancient dominant race were enough to conquer any palate. The Old One's brew was something else entirely. Made from the very essence of the cosmos, every drop contained 1,000 transformations. It was not a wine to be swallowed, but a nectar to be held on the tongue and contemplated to glean truths. Fenrisian mead, by contrast, was brutish, flavor for violence's sake, and scarcely fit for polite company. Soros accepted his brother's courtesy without hesitation. He lifted the glass, swirled the crimson liquid, and breathed in the rich aroma, nostrils flaring. "Good wine," he said, eyes lighting up. "This is the best I've had since I returned to the Imperium." "Of course it's good," Russ added, grinning as he told the tale. "Otherwise, the rogue trader wouldn't have swapped a crate of it for one of my transport ships." Soras blinked, staring down at his glass. "There really is such a thing?" he said with a half-joke. "So, am I holding a piece of a starship right now?" Doom and the others laughed, amused that a flash of humor had cut through his brother's usual seriousness. "You're not wrong. It's worth a lot," Russ boomed, laughing as he snatched the bottle and tipped it back to drain the last drops. "Ah! Now that's the stuff!" He gave a satisfied grunt, then shook the empty bottle at his two brothers. "See? The great wolf has swallowed your ship's engine." Russ's boisterousness lit up the table. The mood brightened immediately. At a wine party, you needed someone like him to drive the conversation and bind everyone together. Doom and Soras exchanged a smile, clinked their glasses, and, unlike Russ, drank the fine wine in their cups without ceremony. The three Primarchs sat together at the giant round table, their easy familiarity suggesting an intimacy born of an unbreakable bond of blood. Around them, in the seating area reserved for the 2nd Legion's Primarch's Guard, legionaries raised their own cups, clinking and laughing as they chatted with cousins from other legions. Alfarius lingered out of sight behind a low flower bed, pretending to study the wine in his cup while his ears remained alert to every word. His appearance was deliberately ordinary, just another trusted warrior from the Primarch's Guard, but his posture was all watchfulness. He took only small sips, keeping his expression neutral and suppressing the smile that wanted to form. To him, the scene was theater. The warm camaraderie, the shared jokes, the brotherly touches were all a careful performance. From where he stood, it was obvious the three brothers were not merely enjoying one another's company. Their conversations skimmed harmlessly over trivialities, stories, small complaints, polite teasing, nothing of substance. They probed each other with questions that revealed nothing. Every smile and laugh was measuring, testing. Alfarius watched coldly, cataloging the performance rather than believing it. Doom's arguments were airtight. The brother with the kingly bearing was just as formidable, his conversational skill flawless, steering and deflecting the exchange with practiced ease. Soras, by contrast, said almost nothing and gave away even less. He had an exquisite sense of where the conversation could be pushed and retreated, and his evasions were brilliantly subtle. As for Russ, Alfarius glanced out of the corner of his eye at his Fenrisian brother. Russ ate and drank heartily, apparently oblivious to the elegant veiled barbs being traded beside him. Alfarius gave a barely noticeable shake of his head, uncertain whether Russ was genuinely simple or merely pretending. Alfarius knew little about the current state of the Space Wolves. Since Russ's return, the agents Alfarius had planted within that legion had found it increasingly hard to remain undercover. The recruits from Fenris, blessed or cursed with the local population's distinctive wolfen helix, had incredibly keen noses and could smell outsiders. With no other choice, Alfarius had withdrawn his sons from the Space Wolves by staging deaths and similar ruses. Now he sat aboard the Royal Majesty as an observer, watching his brothers trade verbal blows. Alfarius left the banquet quietly pleased. A seeker of secrets by nature, his mind was honed to catch what others missed. Tonight, the undercurrents ran clear to him in tiny, telling details. The First Legion presented itself as ordinary, but their coded chatter was far too crude for a Primarch who specialized in subtleties. The Space Wolves hid messages in brutal animal gestures, a bared tooth here, a stare there. The Custode's private language was intricate, layered, and yet not beyond tracing. They were, plainly, watching the Primarchs. The destroyers in their black armor were as silent and unnerving as ever. Throughout the evening, Alfarius kept slipping into that delicious focus of discovery. Every hint, every barely perceptible shift filled him with a kind of physical pleasure. He lived for the moment a pattern snapped into place. He took particular satisfaction in Doom's restraint. The man's caution felt like a keener sort of vigilance, a corrective to something he found worrying in Horus. Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the 16th Legion, was all warmth and enthusiasm at the reunion. His readiness to forgive and embrace his returning brothers was a strength, but it also blinded him. In his eagerness to see them as one, Horus had a blind spot for difference. He failed at times to recognize that Primarchs could be other than he expected. Alpharius respected the sentiment, but he preferred the sharper, less trusting eye. Moribus Saurus, Primarch of the Second Legion and the Emperor's second son, was always surrounded by mists, an inscrutable calm that hid some unspeakable secret beneath its surface. That secret was precisely why Alpharius had come. The Primarch of the 20th Legion, famed as the most secretive of their number, had set himself to learn whatever lay behind Saurus's placid mask. Alpharius accomplished this the only way he knew how, by becoming someone else. He slipped into the Second Legion in the guise of a simple Astartes, killing a legionary, taking his armor and identity, and let his talent for disguise do the rest. Over the years, he worked his way up through the ranks, convincing men and officers alike that he was nothing more than one of their own. Eventually, he earned a place in Saurus's own guard, a position that put him close enough to pry into the hidden life of his blood brother. What Alpharius found was strange. Saurus was almost never seen. He shut himself away in the private quarters of his flagship and admitted no one. He barely intervened in the Legion's day-to-day affairs, leaving its original high command to run everything unchanged. For a Primarch, and for a son of the Emperor, such passivity was startling, and Alpharius suspected there was more behind the silence than simple indifference. When Saurus fought alongside Horus, he always offered sweeping, strategic counsel, but rarely involved himself in the nitty-gritty of tactical planning. His strategic vision was singular. Both Horus and Alpharius recognized that he had the makings of a true war leader. That very brilliance, however, was what made Alpharius wary. A strategist of that caliber who did not accept the Imperium in his heart could inflict terrifying damage. To find out what his blood brother was thinking, Alpharius had covertly slipped into the Second Legion. A few months earlier, Saurus had abruptly ordered the Legion to break from its planned route and head for the Morse star system. The deviation was so out of character, it set every alarm in Alpharius's mind ringing. Was Saurus reacting to a real threat in the sector? Acting on intelligence Alpharius did not yet possess? Driven by some other, private motive? Or none of those things? So Alpharius leaned on his Primarch gift for hearing, straining to catch his brother's conversations and hoping to snare a clue that would cut through the fog around Saurus's decision. The attempt proved frustrating. The three who spoke were careful, measured words, deliberate pauses, and a circumspection that left Alpharius with little more than shadowed fragments and unanswered questions. They talked of romance and beauty, of strange encounters, and the grand vistas they'd crossed while traversing the stars. Alpharius listened without haste. He had time to pry at deeper truths, to let secrets surface in their own time. A soft voice came from behind him. "My lord, may I top your cup?" A handmaiden stepped forward with a pewter jug. On the garden deck, 1,000 mobile attendants moved like a practiced tide, ready to serve the Astartes. Alpharius kept his composure. He turned, extended his glass, and offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you, my lady." Something about her unsettled him. The Primarch noticed the brief quickening of her pulse. Only a beat or two, but more than most could hide. "It is my honor to serve you," she murmured, filled his glass, and withdrew without further sign of worry. Alpharius swirled the wine. For an instant, a strand of minute characters rippled across the surface of the cup and vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His pupils narrowed. The message had been sent and received. He had been exposed. When I opened my eyes, a golden, shimmering figure looked down at me. He lifted me from the scorching grit, wrapped me in a plain robe, and carried me back to his dwelling. There he raised me and taught me. Those who resembled him called him the Emperor. Though he and I looked like the others, I knew we were fundamentally different. He told me to call him Father, to formalize a filial bond that tied us to the human race, a sacred blood tie. Because his blood ran in me, I was to call him Father. So I did. He gave me a name, Alpharius. Alpharius, son of the Emperor, one of the 21 Primarchs. "You have 20 brothers," Father said. When he told me, my heart leapt. I was not alone among the humans. As a son of the Emperor, a Primarch, I moved freely through the half-built palace, wandering its scaffolds and corridors, exploring its grand forms at will. I was born with a hunger for discovery, always seeking surprises, hidden in shadow, and secrets wrapped in layers of darkness. But I kept my own secrets as well. For reasons I could not name, there was a hollow inside me, a void that nothing seemed to touch. It was a relentless emptiness, hungry for anything that might quiet it. I didn't know how to fill it, and that ignorance only made the need worse. In time, I found that secrets could fill that space. Each hidden truth I learned eased the ache. Knowledge itself became a kind of nourishment. As my understanding grew, my body changed too. I developed quickly, and strange talents revealed themselves. I could alter my shape, change my features, take on another face. Malkador told me this was a gift from the Emperor, unlike anything else in the universe. Who was Malkador? An ageless man, dry, withered in appearance, always wrapped in a sackcloth robe and bearing a burning aquila-topped scepter. Don't let the frailty fool you. That was a deliberate guise, an elder's mask to command respect. He was immensely powerful, a master of psychic arts, a repository of deep wisdom and dark knowledge. The Emperor had appointed him my tutor, and Malkador taught me many things. He shaped me into what the Emperor wanted, a keeper of secrets. I learned to spurn vanity, to forgo ordinary glory, and to conceal what I knew. I always preferred to be a seeker of secrets rather than a keeper of them. But I could not disobey Father, so I became a keeper of secrets. On Terra, I kept my true form hidden. Only a handful of people knew Alfarius existed. Constantine Valdor knew, as did his custodian guard. They were the Emperor's personal bodyguards, the men tasked with protecting the master of mankind. I could never reconcile that. Why did a godlike being require a band of lesser mortals to stand watch at his side? Their defenses had gaps you could drive a void ship through, and yet they performed their duty with an unbreakable discipline. I vowed that one day I would teach the custodians a lesson they would not forget. More irritating than their presence, though, was the way they blocked my inquiries. Wherever I tried to probe deeper into Terra's hidden things, they stood between me and knowledge. As a Primarch, I matured too quickly, taller and stronger than any human, and I learned to use my gifts to hide, to bury myself in the ordinary, and study humanity from within. I absorbed their languages and their histories, their superstitions and their science. Under Malkador's tutelage, the purpose behind our creation began to take shape in my mind. Piece by piece, I understood the mission the Primarchs had been given and the burdens that would follow. I have marched through wars, buckled on heavy plate, and taken up aliases to hunt Terran warlords. I watched the Thunder Warriors rage across battlefields and fought beside them until I foresaw their ruin. I saw the first Death Angel rise with my own eyes, and I watched my brother's Gene Sons coalesce into a legion, new blades forged for the Emperor. I stood in the purge of the Thunder Warriors, and once I even glimpsed the hidden truth of the Destroyer Warriors. I saw every great turning and Terra. Some I merely observed, others I lived through. Then the Great Crusade began in earnest. My Gene Sons shed their markings and went under cover. Some were dispersed through other legions, acting as ears and eyes. Others slipped aboard stealth vessels and arrived on worlds ahead of the main fleets, operating behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. My own legion won no public laurels, but my sons shared in the honors of every legion because they were present in all of them. Like me, the 20th Legion preferred to dwell in the shadows, working in the quietest places, doing the most secret work. We were the unseen instruments of the crusade, and our deeds rarely figured in the histories sung on Terra. It was during those years that the Adeptus Mechanicus recovered a lost brother on a world called Chthonia and returned him to Terra. I stood at Father's side, disguised as a custodian guard, and watched my brother return with my own eyes. The name came back to me then, Horus Lupercal. He had become the first Primarch to openly come back to the Imperium. He stayed at the Emperor's side for all to see, and the Luna Wolves basked in the envy of every other legion. I scoffed, though there was pity in it as well. Horus lived inside a lie the Emperor had woven for him. He was not the true first son returned. I was. Alfarius had never left Terra. Horus, proud, self-assured, did not know the truth. He shadowed the Emperor day after day, absorbing the ways of the Imperium, desperate for Father's approval and affection. He threw himself into the work, exhausted and relentless, trying to prove himself. The burden of endless petitions and imperial paperwork broke him. He shaved his head and allowed cranial interfaces to link him to the machines so he could keep up. Watching him like that, so tired and so blind to the reality of what he represented, I could not stand idly by. I ordered my sons to redouble their search for our other brothers across the Great Crusade. We had to find our missing brothers quickly, to ease Horus's burden and to share in some of the affection the Emperor lavished on his favored son. I admit I was selfish about it. I wanted above all to see the look on Horus's face when another brother was reunited with us. My sons searched relentlessly, and at last they turned up someone the scouts strongly suspected was a Primarch, a barbarian lord on a death world called Fenris. I could hardly wait. I boarded a ship and went to Fenris myself to confirm his identity. After careful inquiry, I was convinced. The savage called Lemon Russ was indeed my brother, however unexpected his manner or appearance. Eagerly, I had my sons notify Terra and request that father come claim him. But an accident of timing spoiled my little scheme. Just as the Emperor was preparing to sail for Fenris, another of my brothers found his way home from the void. He returned alone, borne back from the vast star sea by his own strength. I admired that brother with all my heart for making such a return, and I regretted, more than I can say, that I was not on Terra then to witness the look on Horus's face, that indescribable expression I had so wanted to see. I guessed father must have been torn, unwilling to surrender the unique paternal claim he had on me, yet obliged to set an example as the first son returned, magnanimously accepting a returning brother. With no choice but to wait, I held my ship in orbit above Fenris and watched for their arrival. A fast courier from the 20th Legion beamed an image to me, father standing to welcome the 21st. Beside him strode Doom Novik, warrior king, destroyer warrior, master of the Nor worlds. The aura around my brother's head in that transmission struck me. He had done something extraordinary in the void, knitting together shattered civilizations. His power made even Mars tremble and compelled it to yield still greater benefits to the Imperium. The Emperor had raised Doom to equality rather than consigning him beneath the Imperium, a recognition of tremendous weight. I watched Horus as well, his expression changing in a private chamber aboard his battleship. He laughed aloud, an amused sound that lingered in the image. Eager anticipation spread through my legion. My sons donned the power armor of the 5th Legion, and I, blended among them, boarded the Emperor's dream. In the ship's gilded palace, I finally saw my brother in person. He was even more imposing and magnificent than the image had suggested. His eyes swept the crowd, and for a moment I felt exposed, as if Doom could see straight through me. It was only a glance, but it pulled the past into sharp focus. My distinguished brother, who had abandoned the Emperor's dream and thrown himself into the Great Crusade. The Crusade of the Legions was a quiet thing in many respects. The 20th excelled in gathering intelligence, in asymmetrical warfare. They took worlds without trumpets, slipping through defenses and claiming systems that never knew they'd been conquered. When I heard of Moribus Soras's reclusiveness, Lord of the 2nd Legion, my curiosity became an obsession. I slipped into the 2nd under a false name and a falsified record, and settled in to do my secret work. My brother, unpredictable as ever, had been at Horus's side and then had raced without pause to the Morse star system. There was another theater of war there as well. Doom Novik was leading a large force against the Rangdan. The systems around Morse were strewn with wreckage. Amid the debris, I found the battered hulls of Space Wolves vessels. The scars on those warships told me more clearly than any report just how savage the fighting had been, what my brother had already been through. Doom's flagship hosted a garden banquet, a false calm after the storm. A handmaiden moved among the guests and poured me wine. When I lifted the cup, I saw the hidden message traced on the inside. An inked sign meant only for me. It hit me like cold water. My kingly brother had not been fooled. He had known my disguise for a long time. Alfarius paused, then devised a way to slip away. "Brother, I'll be over there for a moment," he said, pointing toward the 1st Legion's seating. "I'm going to greet an old comrade." The captain of the Primarch's Guard inclined his head. A colleague's report had just come to him, and he turned toward the man Alfarius had been impersonating. "It's a blessing to meet an old Terra veteran at a gathering," he said. He shook his head with a rueful sigh. "Most of my batch of test subjects died on the battlefield." "I'll be back in 10 minutes, Alfarius promised, then rose and walked toward the First Legion. There was, of course, no old Terra veteran waiting. The First Legion contained his gene sons, and Alfarius needed only an excuse and a witness. He rushed a little, putting on the eager gait of someone going to meet a long-lost friend. He reached one of his gene sons and gave the warrior's pauldron a friendly pat. The soldier's eyes, however, registered only confusion. He didn't recognize the Second Legion Primarch standing before him. "Who are you?" The Legion warrior rose from his chair out of respect and asked the newcomer's name. He raked his memory for any sign of the man before him, certain he had never seen him and wondering if there had been a mistake. Alfarius smiled and motioned for him to lean in. The men around them did not find the gesture odd. Among the Astartes, it was common to abandon birth names and take new ones, thanking the emperor for the rebirth. Old names were often discarded or kept only as private tokens between comrades. Alfarius closed the distance and whispered a single word into the warrior's ear, a sound meant for only the two of them. "Alfarius." The effect was instantaneous. The warrior's face went white as the whispered word triggered buried conditioning. Memories snapped into place like a lock releasing. He was not who he appeared to be in the barracks. He was a 20th Legion operative, deliberately brainwashed and planted inside the First, and the man before him, the speaker of the code, was his gene father. The infiltrator broke into an ecstatic grin and threw his arms around Alfarius. "It's you, my brother," he cried. The joy was genuine. The surprise of seeing a fellow countryman and friend was written plainly on his face. The other Alpha Legionnaires clustered nearby, all wore the same satisfied, "I knew it" look. After the Astartes augmentations, the features of many warriors had shifted, taking on the temper and mannerisms of their gene father. It was not uncommon for comrades to fail to recognize one another at first. That was why a prearranged countersign existed to confirm identity. Using his obvious excitement to hide the tremor of returning memories, the infiltrator leaned close and whispered the Legion cry into his gene father's ear. "We are all Alfarius." Alfarius had named his 20th Legion the Alpha Legion. Alpha was not only a reference to the Primarch's own name. On Old Terra, the word carried the sense of beginning, of being first. In that choice there was the insinuation, subtle but deliberate, that Alfarius himself was the first to come back. The true first son returned. "We are all Alfarius," the Alpha Legionnaire repeated softly, the mantra binding him to his gene father. His display was half-acted, half-real, the thrill of seeing his gene father threaded into the performance so seamlessly that truth and deception blurred. To the First Legionnaires watching, he'd simply recognized a comrade and been overwhelmed for a moment. "Cover me as I leave," he added, and Alfarius, pleased with the performance, found no fault in it. At the level of an Astartes, the acting was flawless. "Let's go over there and catch up." The infiltrator pointed to one side, took Alfarius's arm, and called back to the First Legion warriors, "I'll be gone a bit." They waved them off enthusiastically. Alfarius followed, and the two slipped away from the crowd, vanishing into a quiet corner of the garden. To any onlooker, they looked like old friends slipping away for a private conversation. When they reached the secluded spot, the garden floor opened and a concealed lift rose silently. Alfarius recognized the invitation. His brother had summoned him. He stepped inside, turned to face his gene son, and before the doors closed said, "I need 9 minutes of testimony. You can continue your work." The infiltrator gave a slow, measured nod and watched his gene father step into the elevator and begin to descend into the deck. The Primarch disappeared from sight, and a quiet confusion settled in him. The ship's AI had already flagged him, so why did Alfarius still want him to remain undercover? He did not hesitate. Alpha agents rarely relied on costumes or forged papers. They relied on memory. The man closed his eyes, murmured a precise sequence of trigger words, and let the practiced hypnosis wash over him. He shaped his recollections deliberately. When the trance broke, he would be a First Legion warrior who had met an old friend from the Second Legion here, and remembered certain shared events. It was all part of the same deception. Alpha operatives were not simply pretending to be something they were not. Until their memories were unlocked, they genuinely believed themselves to be members of other legions. Alpharius had planted an unknown number of such sleepers across the legions, and only the Primarch himself knew how many. Alpharius's face had been grave as the elevator sank. He paced the small shaft with the kind of attention that became obsession, turning over the single uncomfortable question: how had they been discovered? Then, as the car came to a stop and the doors parted, his expression changed. A new idea brightened his eyes, sudden, sharp, and ready to be tested. He had sized them up at a glance and thought the Night Watch would be perfect for his gene sons to infiltrate Nur. The Destroyer warriors were out of the question. They were too tall, their proportions towering well beyond an Astartes, and impossible for an Alpha Legion warrior to imitate convincingly. The Night Watch, by contrast, were almost the right fit. A similar build, physical capabilities that slightly exceeded an Astartes, but not so far as to be impossible to mimic. Put that out of your head, brother of King Nawick. The veteran Night Watch saw his intentions instantly. Through the dark visor of his helmet, his expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice as he explained. Our culture here has an unbroken tradition. If you want to impersonate one of us or take our place, you don't just need a uniform. You need decades at the War College to learn the subtleties. He tapped his helmet lightly. Miss even one nuance, a single phrase in everyday speech, and the imposter will be found out. The veteran made a small, disarming gesture, as if to say please, then turned and began to lead the way, leaving the king's brother to swallow his thwarted schemes. He wasn't lying. The Night Watch had its roots in Nur, and it carried a deep warrior tradition. Nur's martial culture was dominant, but over thousands of years, it had branched into many distinct strains. The version preserved at the War College, however, was the orthodox one, tested, formalized, and required study for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously. On top of that came the clan and family customs that tied into the mainstream, a detail in an emblem, a tweak to a technique, an allusion tucked into an old proverb, the precise meaning of a piece of warrior etiquette. All of that could keep the descendants of the Golden Men studying for decades, and many of them failed, so the level of difficulty was not hard to imagine. There was one thing the veteran hadn't mentioned, though: Nur's genetic screening. In Nur's darker days, when their genes were degenerating, routine screenings were used to prevent harmful mutations. Even after the transition into the Age of Stars stabilized their genetic decline, the screenings only grew stricter. As a world directly under the Night Watch, Nur banned intermarriage with outside Urs and barred the settlement of foreign populations. The Night Watch were subject to routine genetic screenings. They had to submit data to Nur, run genetic matches, and leave behind qualified offspring. For anyone trying to infiltrate them, that made escape almost impossible. Even without the tests, there was a simpler way to tell them apart. When the Night Watch and the Astartes stripped down, the differences were immediate. Astartes bore black carapaces across their skin, external interface plates used for neural links to power armor. The Night Watch, by contrast, only had spinal neural ports, 3 implants in a column along the spine that connected to their armor. Beyond that, their bodies showed no other modifications. Their sensor suites shared the same basic tech, but the scope and placement of the modifications set them apart unmistakably. Alpharius fell in beside the Night Watch unit, slowly shaking his head. He glanced at the warrior next to him and asked, almost wryly, "Are all of you this perceptive? Could he really have been read so easily? Was his expression that transparent?" The veteran shrugged. His voice, muffled by the helmet, came slow and deliberate. "Your surprise was written all over your face. Add to that your being an infiltrator, and it was easy enough to put 2 and 2 together." Alpharius nodded. He'd been too transparent. His expression and purpose had given him away. "You call him King Nawick?" he asked as they walked, interested in the Night Watch's choice of name. A title usually says as much about how someone is seen as any formal rank. The Night Watch puffed out his chest a little. "Doom Novik, the man they call King Nawick." "Why not Primarch?" Alpharius couldn't help but ask. "That sounds nobler. He is, after all, the master of mankind's son. The warrior scoffed and shook his head. Primarch? Noble? His tone was flat. Noack stands for something that never bends, which is nobler, a bloodline handed down, or a spirit that refuses to break. Alfarius opened his mouth to answer, but in the end he said nothing. A night watchman led him down a dim corridor to a concealed door flanked by 2 warriors. The watchman stopped, pointed at the entrance, and said, "He's waiting for you in there."